Bram Voss didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the door to Redstone Hollow's kitchen like he already owned the floorboards beneath his boots, dropped a folded paper onto the table where Eliza was still eating breakfast, and said 4 words that made her stomach turn to stone. Sign it, or thirst. The offer on that paper was exactly half what the ranch was worth, half of what her husband had bled for, half of what she had been killing herself to hold together for 8 months. Eliza looked up at him. Bram Voss was smiling the way men smile when they already know the ending. She pushed the paper back across the table without touching her fork. Get off my land. Bram picked up the paper slowly, folded it back into his coat pocket, and nodded like she'd said something amusing. Then he walked out, and quietly diverted the creek that fed everything she owned. If that were your home, your land, everything you had left, what would you do? Before we go further, if stories like this move you, if you believe in people who refuse to quit when the whole world is betting against them, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop a comment below telling me your city and country. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it hits something real in you, leave a like. It costs nothing and it means everything. Now, let's go back to Montana, Plantation 86, and a widow who was about to teach an entire valley what stubborn really looks like. The morning Thomas Harrow died, Eliza had been outside splitting kindling. She heard the sound, not a loud sound, almost nothing, just a single thud from inside the barn, and something in her chest already knew before her feet started moving. She found him on the dirt floor between the 2 stalls he'd mucked out 1,000 times. He was 41 years old. His heart simply stopped, the way a clock stops sometimes for no reason anyone can explain. The doctor came from Millhaven, confirmed what she already understood, and left before noon. The Reverend came the following morning. Neighbors brought food for 3 days, then they stopped coming. And Eliza was left standing in the middle of nearly 5,000 acres of Montana grassland, in the last week of November with 34 cattle, 2 hired hands whose names she could barely remember, 1 aging foreman named Cutter, who walked with a limp from an old horse injury, and a mortgage payment that came due on the 1st of every month, regardless of whether your husband was alive or dead. She was 29 years old. She had never run a ranch alone. She had never needed to. Thomas had been the kind of man who handled everything quietly, without being asked. He fixed fences before they needed fixing. He knew which cattle were carrying trouble before the trouble showed. He had a relationship with the land that Eliza had always admired from beside him, never thinking about the day she might have to develop it herself. The first month was purely survival. She paid the mortgage by selling 2 steers she couldn't afford to lose. She ate less than she should have. She slept badly and woke up every morning feeling like she'd already lost something she hadn't lost yet. The second month, one of the hired hands, a young man named Decker, came to her on a Sunday evening with his hat in his hands and told her he was leaving. "Nothing personal, Mrs. Harrow," he said. "It's just, this outfit needs a man running it." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're right," she said. "It needs a man who shows up. Since you're leaving, we'll have to make do without one." Decker left the next morning. The other hand, a quiet fellow named Ames, stayed another 3 weeks before drifting toward a larger operation north of Millhaven. He didn't even tell her directly. He just stopped appearing at breakfast one morning, and Cutter found his bunk cleared out. Cutter himself was 63, loyal as a fence post, and increasingly limited by his hip. He could supervise. He could remember. He could offer counsel that was genuinely worth hearing, but he could not ride hard or move fast, and Eliza knew it, and Cutter knew she knew it, and they didn't discuss it because discussing it wouldn't change anything. By late February, she had hired 2 new hands from the labor notices in Millhaven, brothers, actually, named Pete and Cal Dunner. They were decent workers, neither exceptional nor unreliable. They followed instructions without questioning them and did exactly what was asked and nothing beyond it. Good men in their way. Not the kind of men who notice a problem before it becomes a crisis. She paid them fair wages she could barely sustain and pushed through the remainder of winter by working herself so thoroughly into exhaustion each night that she had no energy left for fear. But fear found her anyway. It found her in the quiet moments, the hour between midnight and 1 in the morning when the wind was high and the cattle were restless, and she was lying in the bed she had shared with Thomas for 6 years, staring at the ceiling, calculating hay supply against expected winter length, calculating mortgage payment against current beef prices, calculating the probability that she could hold this together without some piece of it breaking in a way she couldn't repair. The numbers were never comfortable. Spring arrived slowly, stubbornly, the way Montana springs do. And with it came the other thing she had been anticipating without quite admitting to herself. Bram Voss. She had known Bram Voss by reputation long before she knew him directly. Thomas had described him once as a man who builds fences around things that aren't his yet. He controlled somewhere near 12,000 acres in the wider valley. His cattle operation dwarfed Redstone Hollows by a scale that was almost embarrassing to compare. He employed more hands than Eliza had cattle. He was not a man who lacked for anything, which made what he wanted from her more insulting, not less. He arrived on a Tuesday in early April with 2 of his men positioned carefully behind him. Not close enough to be threatening, exactly, but close enough to be noticed. He was in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, with silver in his hair, and the kind of face that had learned over decades to look pleasant even when it wasn't. He tied his horse at her porch railing like he'd done it before, though he hadn't, and walked up the steps without hurrying. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, and removed his hat, which was a courtesy she noticed and did not trust. "Mr. Voss? I want to start by saying I have enormous respect for what you've managed since losing Thomas." The man was well regarded. His passing was a genuine loss for this valley. "Thank you," she said, and waited. "I'll come to the point," he said. "I have an interest in expanding my operation southward. Your land sits in a position that would complete what I've been building for some years. I want to make you an offer, a fair offer, a real offer, for Redstone Hollow." He named a price. It was not a fair offer. It was not a real offer. It was a number that accounted for the land's raw acreage, while completely ignoring the water access, the established grazing, the years of improvement. Thomas had built into the soil and fencing and water management. It was the price you offered a woman you expected to be desperate. Eliza didn't flinch. "I'm not selling," she said. Bram nodded slowly. "I understand this is sudden. Take some time to consider." "I don't need time. I'm not selling. Redstone Hollow was my husband's work, and it's my land, and I'm not selling it." Something shifted in Bram's expression. Not anger, not quite. It was more subtle than anger. It was the small recalibration a man makes when a situation doesn't proceed as planned, and he needs to decide on an alternate approach without letting you see the decision being made. "Well," he said, "I respect that." He replaced his hat. "Good day, Mrs. Harrow." He rode away with his men, and Eliza stood on the porch watching him go, and felt the kind of relief that knows it won't last. She was right. It didn't last 3 weeks. That was when Ronan Vale appeared. He came from the North Road on a Thursday morning in late April, riding a horse that looked like it had been covering distance for several days. The horse was sound. She noticed that immediately, the way a person who has spent years around animals learns to read them at a distance, but tired. The rider looked the same. Not sick, not desperate, just worn by travel the way men get when they've been moving long enough that stopping feels strange. He came to the fence at the edge of the yard and waited there. He didn't shout. He didn't ride forward uninvited. He just waited until Eliza walked out to meet him. "Ma'am," he said, "name's Ronan Vale. Heard in Mill Haven you might be looking for a steady hand." She looked at him the way she had learned to look at men who came asking for work. Measuring, direct, not unkind but not accommodating either. He was somewhere around mid-30s, she guessed. Medium height, lean in the way that comes from physical work rather than from not eating. He had a calm about him that she couldn't immediately categorize. Not confidence, exactly. Closer to stillness. "I'm not running a charity outfit," she said. "This is hard work, long hours, and I'll tell you straight. I've had men walk off this property because they didn't want to take direction from a woman." "I heard that too," he said, "in Millhaven. And you're still here." "I'm still here." She studied him another moment. "You have references?" "No." "Previous outfit?" "Several. None in this territory." Which was either honest or suspicious, and she wasn't sure yet which. "I've got a horse," she said. "Mare, 4 years old. She's frightened of everything, and she bites, and she's put 2 men in the dirt in the past month. The last man who tried to work with her came out of the corral walking sideways." Ronan Vale looked toward the corral. "Which one?" She pointed. He dismounted, looped his horse's reins over the fence, and walked toward the corral gate without asking her permission or requesting further instruction. She followed at a distance and watched. He didn't go in immediately. He stood at the fence for a long moment, just watching the mare. The mare watched him back, ears forward, body tense, ready for whatever provocation she'd learned to anticipate from the men who'd come at her fast and hard and gone away cursing. Ronan didn't go fast. He didn't go hard. He opened the gate slowly and walked into the corral and simply stood there. Not advancing, not retreating, just present. The mare shifted her weight and tossed her head, and he didn't react. She moved to the far end of the corral, and he stood in the center and waited. After perhaps 5 minutes, long, quiet minutes that Eliza watched from outside the fence without speaking, the mare's posture changed. Barely. Just the beginning of a change. Her ears relaxed a fraction. Her weight settled differently. Ronan took one step toward her. She didn't bolt. He waited again. Another step. Waited. He was talking to her, Eliza realized. Low, continuous, not loud enough to hear from outside the fence. Something conversational, like he was explaining something to her rather than commanding it. It took 20 minutes. At the end of 20 minutes, the mare was standing still, and Ronan Vale had his hand on her neck. And the mare's eyes had that particular softness in them that Eliza had only seen before when Thomas worked with a difficult animal. Ronan walked back out of the corral and latched the gate and looked at Eliza. "She's not mean," he said. "She's just been handled wrong." Eliza hired him. She paid him fair wages and gave him the second bunk in the hands' quarters and introduced him to Cutter and to Pete and Cal Dunner. And within 48 hours, she could see that Cutter approved of him, which mattered more than she admitted out loud, because Cutter's judgment about people was, in her experience, almost never wrong. The first week, Ronan worked without speaking more than necessary. He was there at first light and still working at dusk, and he didn't complain, and he didn't offer opinions he hadn't been asked for. He had the quality she valued most in a person, which was the ability to look at a problem and address the actual problem rather than the version of it that was easiest to talk about. He also had opinions. She discovered that gradually, not loud opinions, not argumentative ones, but if she asked him directly what he thought about something, he would tell her, and what he told her was usually worth hearing. She asked him, at the end of his first week, what he thought about the coming roundup. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was always quiet before answering something that mattered. "You're short-handed for the size of the herd," he said. "Pete and Cal are fine, but Roundup isn't fine country. It's hard country. You're going to need more hands for that week, or you're going to lose cattle." "Where would I find hands for 1 week?" "Men between outfits," he said. "Millhaven Saloon on a weeknight. I could go." "You'd recruit for me?" "If you want." She thought about it. "Do it," she said. He came back with 3 temporary hands. Men she'd never met, men she couldn't evaluate. And she made herself trust his judgment because she didn't have a better option and because his judgment, so far, had been sound. The roundup went harder than she'd expected and better than she'd feared. She lost 1 steer to a creek crossing and came within a moment of losing more when a section of the herd spooked and drove toward a dangerous cutbank above the creek's east bend. Ronan took the far position, the more dangerous one, without being asked, and turned the lead animals before the momentum could build into something unstoppable. She saw it from across the draw and felt something shift in her chest that she didn't examine too carefully. That same night, sitting by the fire after the rest of the men were asleep, Cutter looked at her for a long moment over his coffee cup and said, "That man rides like he's been doing it his whole life." "He has been," she said. "That's not what I mean," Cutter said, and went back to his coffee and didn't explain further. Eliza lay awake that night for a long time, listening to the Montana dark and not thinking about Ronan Vale, which was a form of thinking about him. 4 days after Roundup ended, the creek shrank. Not drought. She'd seen drought, knew its rhythms, and this wasn't it. The water level dropped too quickly, too suddenly, in a pattern that didn't match the sky or the season. Pete noticed it first and told Cutter, and Cutter told Eliza, and Eliza walked the creek east with Ronan on a cool morning with clouds building in the northwest. They found it about a mile upstream from the main pasture. A gate. New construction, heavy timber, and iron hardware, recently sunk into the creek bank on both sides. Opened, it would allow the creek to flow normally toward Redstone Hollow. Closed, It redirected water through a newly cut channel that ran northeast toward Bram Voss's property. It was closed. Eliza stood there looking at it, and the feeling that moved through her was not quite rage and not quite fear. It was something colder than either, the feeling of understanding a situation completely for the first time, in a moment when that understanding arrives too late to be surprised by it. "He built this," she said. It wasn't a question. "His men did," Ronan said. "This week, I'd guess. Maybe 10 days ago." She turned to look at him. "Can he do this?" Ronan's jaw worked for a moment. "Legally? He controls the land it's built on. Water rights in this territory are—" He paused. "Complicated." "Complicated," she repeated. "He'll say the water runs through his property first and he has the right to manage it. Whether that holds up depends on prior use and how long Redstone Hollow has been drawing from this creek. Thomas's family settled this land in 1861, she said. 25 years. Something changed in Ronan's expression. "How well documented?" "I don't know. Thomas handled records." "We need to find out," Ronan said. "Tonight." They rode back to the ranch in the kind of silence that isn't comfortable but isn't hostile either. It's the silence of two people thinking hard about the same problem from different angles. That evening, after the other men had eaten and turned in, Eliza went through Thomas's papers. She had opened the document box twice since his death. Once looking for the mortgage paperwork, and once looking for something else she couldn't remember now. And both times she had closed it quickly because opening it felt like something she wasn't ready for. She opened it now and made herself stay. Ronan sat across the table from her, not helping, not intruding, present, which was different from helpful in a way she was beginning to understand. She went through deed records, property surveys, a hand-drawn map of the original land grant that was brown at the edges and soft at the folds from decades of handling. "Here," she said. She laid a document flat on the table. It was a water use record, dated 1863, filed with the Territorial Land Office and bearing the signature of Thomas's father and a territorial land agent whose name she didn't recognize. Ronan looked at it without touching it. He read it. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture settled. "This establishes prior use," he said. "Is that enough?" "Depends on what Bram files. But it's something. It's real something." He sat back. "He's going to file a claim. That's what the gate was. Preparation. He's going to build a legal structure around something he's already done physically. That's how men like that work. They move first and formalize second." "How long do we have?" Ronan looked at the document again. "If he files quickly, 30 days, maybe. After that, depending on which agent handles it, water could legally redirect and you'd need a court to reverse it." 30 days. She looked across the table at him. "You know a lot about this for a ranch hand." He didn't look away. "I wasn't always a ranch hand." She waited. He didn't offer more. She didn't push. There was something deliberate in the way he'd said it. Not closed exactly, but not open either. A door that was present without being unlocked. She filed it away and returned to the problem in front of her. "What do we do?" she said. Ronan was quiet for a long moment. Not the hesitation of someone who doesn't know, more like the pause of someone choosing between two things they know. "We go back tonight," he said finally. "Not to fight. To see." "See what?" "See if they're still working. See what they're doing. Because if they're expanding that gate, building it bigger, which is what I'd do if I were Bram, then we know what timeline we're actually on." They rode out past midnight. Moonlight, cool air. The sound of the creek reduced to a trickle where it had been a reasonable flow 3 weeks before. They tied the horses a quarter-mile back and walked the rest on foot through the brush along the creek bank. And when they came around the bend where the gate stood, they found 4 men working by lantern light, sledging posts into the eastern bank of the new diversion channel, making it permanent, making it bigger. Eliza's hands tightened at her sides. Ronan touched her arm. One brief, light touch, just a signal. He walked forward out of the brush. The 4 men stopped working. One of them reached toward his belt. "Don't," Ronan said, and his voice carried a particular quality that Eliza recognized but couldn't name. The quality of a man who has been in enough tense moments that he no longer gets tense in them. "Nobody needs to do anything foolish out here tonight." The man's hand stopped. "Who are you?" one of the others said. "Redstone Hollow," Ronan said simply. You're on Redstone Hollow's water, and I need whoever's responsible for this decision to come talk to me." There was a long moment. Then one of the men left toward the tree line, and after several minutes, during which nobody spoke and nobody moved much, Bram Voss walked into the lantern light from the shadow of the cottonwoods. He was in a dark coat. His hat was on. He looked at Ronan, then past him at Eliza, and the look he gave her was the one she had been expecting since the morning he first walked up her porch steps. The look that said he had always known it would come to this, that he'd always known he would be standing here, in this moment, because the conclusion was never in doubt. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, "this is a late hour for a woman to be out." "This is an unusual thing to find on my water," she said. Bram looked at the construction around him with a kind of easy ownership. "Your water," he said. "That's actually the question, isn't it?" "It'll be answered," Ronan said. "In 30 days, at the territorial office. But tonight, you'll have your men stop work." Bram turned his gaze to Ronan fully for the first time. He studied him the way a man studies something unfamiliar he's trying to place. "And if I don't?" "Then we'll be back," Ronan said. "And we won't be alone." Something passed between them. Not quite threat, not quite negotiation, some other kind of understanding between two people who are both measuring what the other one is actually capable of. Bram took his time, then he turned and spoke to his men. "Pack it up for tonight." The men set down their tools. Bram looked at Eliza one last time. "You're a stubborn woman," he said, not unkindly. "Thomas was the same. It's an admirable quality." He paused. "It's also the quality that causes the most suffering in the end." He walked back into the dark of the cottonwoods. Eliza stood there in the lantern light that Bram's men were already beginning to pack up, feeling the cold come down from the mountains in the way it does in Montana, even in summer after midnight. And she thought about Thomas, and about stubborn, and about suffering, and about 5,000 acres of hard grassland that she had never intended to be responsible for alone. She hadn't asked for this fight, but Bram Voss had just made her a promise in that last sentence, dressed up as a compliment, and she understood it clearly. He wasn't stopping, he was filing the claim. And in 30 days, the creek that fed everything she had built her future on could legally become his. She walked back toward the horses in the dark, and Ronan fell in beside her, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, she said, "He's going to file." "Tomorrow," Ronan said, "or the day after." "Then we have to be faster." He didn't answer immediately. She glanced at him, his face in the moonlight, looking straight ahead, that stillness he carried with him everywhere, the stillness she had spent 6 weeks trying to decide whether it was peace or something else entirely. "We can be," he said. She believed him. She wasn't sure yet whether that was wisdom or desperation, but she held on to it the rest of the way home, through the cold dark, along a creek that was barely running. Because 30 days was not nothing, and Eliza Harrow had survived worse than 30 days. She had survived 8 months of a world telling her she couldn't hold what she had. She wasn't done proving it wrong. Bram's claim arrived at the Territorial Land Office in Mill Haven on a Thursday morning, 2 days after the confrontation at the creek. Ronan had predicted it would come that fast, and he'd been right, and being right about it didn't make it easier to hear. Cutter brought the news back from town along with the weekly supply order, setting the flour and salt on the kitchen table, and then standing there with his hat in his hands, looking at Eliza like a man delivering word of a second death. "Official filing," he said, posted at the office window. Bram Voss claiming prior management rights to the tributary creek running south-southwest through sections 14 and 15. Eliza looked at the flour on the table. She had needed that flour. She had ridden through cold mud to afford that flour. And now she was standing in her kitchen, being told that the water she used to grow the wheat to make the bread that sustained the men who kept the cattle alive was formally, legally, under contest by a man who already owned more than he could ever use. "When's the hearing?" she said. 31 days. 1 day longer than Ronan had estimated. 1 extra day that felt less like a gift and more like the universe's idea of a joke. She turned and walked out of the kitchen and across the yard to the corral fence and stood there with both hands on the top rail, looking at nothing in particular, letting the specific weight of 31 days settle into her shoulders, where all the other weights had already taken up residence. The morning was cool and overcast, the kind of Montana sky that can't decide between rain and just threatening it, and the mountains to the northwest were hidden in low cloud. She heard Ronan's boots behind her. She knew his walk by now. She had noticed that about herself sometime in the past 2 weeks, without finding it troubling, the way you learn the particular sounds of a house you've lived in long enough. He stopped beside her at the fence and didn't say anything for a moment. "Cutter told you," she said. "Yeah." She kept looking at the mountains that weren't visible. 31 days to prove my family has been using that creek for 25 years. Longer, if we count your father-in-law's first use. The document said 1863. Then we have 23 years of prior use to establish, he said, against a claim filed last Thursday by a man with lawyers. She turned to look at him. "You said we could be faster." "I said we could be." He met her eyes. "I didn't say it would be easy." "Nothing about any of this has been easy." "No," he agreed. "It hasn't." She turned back to the fence. A crow landed on the barn roof and looked down at them with the particular indifference of crows everywhere, then left. The sky pressed low and gray and unhelpful. "What do we do?" she said. Not the first time she'd asked him that. Not the last, she suspected. Ronan leaned against the fence rail beside her. He was quiet for a moment in that way of his. Not stalling, thinking. She had learned to wait out the quiet. "Paper wins in a territorial hearing," he said. "Bram knows that. His lawyers know that. The document you found from 1863 is real, and it's valuable, but it's one piece. What beats paper is witnesses, people who remember, people who can stand up in front of a land agent and say, under oath, that they watched Redstone Hollow pull water from that creek before Bram Voss ever set foot in this valley. Who would those people be? Old-timers, he said. Settlers who were here early. People who knew Thomas's father. People who watered their own stock from that creek, or watched you do it, or helped you do it." He paused. "And smaller ranchers Bram has been squeezing, because I'd wager my saddle he hasn't only done this to you." She thought about that. There were families she knew. The Pembroke outfit southeast of Mill Haven, the widow Aldine who ran sheep on the north slope, old Harlan Grice who'd been in the valley since before the railroad came. People who kept to themselves and didn't make trouble and had been, as far as she could tell, slowly running out of room in a valley that Bram Voss was quietly swallowing. "They won't want to get involved," she said. "People don't line up to fight a man like Bram unless they have to." "Not unless someone asks them directly," Ronan said. "And not unless they believe the person asking has a real chance." She looked at him. "Do we have a real chance?" He held her gaze. "I think we have a fighting chance, which is different." She absorbed that. "All right," she said. "We ride." "Not together," he said. "You go to the families you know. I'll go to the ones I don't, the ones who might talk more freely to someone who doesn't have a stake." "You have a stake," she said. "You work here." "They don't know that yet." She started to argue and stopped because he was right, and arguing with a correct thing was a habit she was trying to break. "When do we start?" "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Early." She nodded and pushed off the fence rail and turned toward the house, and then stopped. There was something she had been carrying for 3 days, and she had been deciding whether to put it down. She turned back. "Ronan," he looked at her. "That night at the creek, when Bram's men stopped working, they stopped because of you. Not because of me. You know that." He was quiet. "I need to know what that is," she said. "I need to know who I'm asking to help me, because I'm about to ask you to help me with the most important thing I have, and I don't know where you come from, or what you've done, or why you're still here when you could have found easier work." It was the longest thing she had said to him all at once, and she felt slightly exposed by the end of it, like a person who has been holding a door shut for a long time and finally leaned back from it. Ronan looked at the ground for a moment. Then he looked up. "I'll tell you," he said, "but not standing in a yard. Tonight, after supper." She nodded once. She went back inside to count the days she had and figure out which of them she could afford to spend. That evening, after Pete and Cal had finished eating and drifted back to the bunkhouse, and Cutter had taken himself to bed with the deliberate care of a man whose hip talks to him at the end of every day, Eliza and Ronan sat at the kitchen table with coffee that had been on the stove too long and was somewhat past its best, but neither of them mentioned it. Ronan turned his cup in his hands a few times. He had a habit of handling things without holding them too tightly. Horses, fences, conversations. She had noticed it before without naming it. "I had land," he said. "Wyoming. About 3,000 acres, which felt like the whole world at the time. I was 26, 27. Bought it with money I'd worked 12 years to save, starting from nothing, which I mean literally. I grew up with nothing worth describing. The land was everything. He paused. Good grazing, decent water, 2 good horses and a small herd I was building slow. He stopped. She didn't fill the silence. Drought came in the fall of '79, he continued. Bad drought. Worse than anything the old-timers said they'd seen. The grass died, then the creek ran low, then it stopped. I held on longer than I should have, borrowing against the land to buy feed, convincing myself it would break. He set the cup down. It didn't break in time. By spring of '80, I'd lost the cattle, then the horses, then the land. Bank took it on a Tuesday morning. I was 28 years old, and I had nothing again. Eliza watched his face. It was the same face he wore every day, the same stillness, but something underneath it was showing through, the way old markings show through a coat of paint in certain kinds of light. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it. It was a long time ago, he said. It was the kind of thing people say that is true, and also not the point. And since then? Since then I've worked other men's land, he said, purposely, because you can't lose what you don't own. She sat with that for a moment. That's a hard way to live. It's a safe way, he said. Safe and hard aren't always different things. What made you come here, she said. Of all the outfits in Montana. He looked at her directly. I heard a widow was fighting to keep her land against a man who expected her to fold. I thought... He stopped, started again. I thought that was worth seeing. She held his gaze and didn't look away and didn't say the several things that came to her, because some things don't need to be spoken to be understood, and this was one of them. Get some sleep, she said finally. We ride early. He stood. Yes, ma'am. Eliza, she said. He picked up his hat from the chair back where he'd set it. Eliza, he said, and went out, and she sat with her cold coffee and listened to the quiet settle back into the house. The next 6 days were the hardest kind of hard. Not dramatic hard, not crisis hard, but the grinding, discouraging kind of hard that doesn't give you anything clean to push against. They rode separately and sometimes together, covering ground across the valley and into the lower foothills, knocking on doors and coming around to back paddocks, and sitting in kitchens that were very much like Eliza's kitchen, worn down, carefully maintained, doing their best. The first family they visited was the Penbrooks, southeast of town. Walt Penbrook was in his late 60s, a lean man with white hair and the kind of dry skepticism that accumulates from decades of watching promises not be kept. His wife, June, served coffee without being asked and stood at the counter with her arms folded while Eliza explained what she needed. Walt listened to the whole thing without expression. You want me to sign something, he said when she finished. A sworn statement that you remember Redstone Hollow drawing water from the creek before Bram purchased his upstream parcel. Walt looked at his coffee cup. I remember a lot of things, he said. I know you do. I remember Bram Voss's men rerouting the access road I'd used for 11 years to get my stock to the south pasture. He said it without heat, which somehow made it worse. Took them 2 days to grade a new road on my own property that added 40 minutes to every cattle drive I run. When I complained to the territorial office, I was told the original road ran across his property line. He paused. By about 8 feet. June made a sound from the counter that wasn't quite a word. 8 feet, Eliza said. 8 feet. Walt put his cup down. Where do I sign? The second place went worse. A younger rancher named Cord Tellis, mid-30s, 2 small children, a wife who looked like she hadn't slept properly in weeks. He listened to Eliza on his porch, with his arms crossed and his jaw set. I can't, he said. I'm sorry. I can't. Cord, he holds the note on my equipment loan, Cord said quietly. You understand what I'm saying? He's the one I borrowed from when the bank wouldn't give me terms. You want me to go against him in a hearing? You're asking me to hand him a reason to call that note. Eliza stood on his porch and looked at this young man with the circles under his eyes and the children's voices behind the closed door, and felt the specific, miserable weight of an argument she couldn't make. She couldn't tell him to risk his family. She didn't have the right. I understand, she said. She rode away from the Tellis place and didn't say much for the next mile. Ronan rode beside her. After a while he said, He's not the only one like that. I know. Bram has loans out all over this valley, Ronan said. It's not just the land, it's the money. He's built himself into the walls. Then how do we pull him out? Ronan didn't answer right away. They crested a low rise and the valley spread below them, wide, brown gold in the early afternoon sun, the creek's line visible as a thread of darker green through the dry summer grass. It was beautiful in the way that hard country is beautiful, which is without apology and without caring whether you appreciate it. People who owe him money won't talk, Ronan said, but people who don't anymore might. People who paid it off or people he never lent to in the first place. He turned to look at her. How old is Harlan Grice? Old enough to remember the original survey, she said. Then we start there. Harlan Grice lived in a house that was older than half the people in the valley, a low-slung place with a porch that listed slightly to the east, and a cook stove that had been burning continuously since before Eliza was born, or so the story went. I was 74 and moved like a man who was in conversation with his own body about what it would and wouldn't agree to do on any given morning. But his eyes were sharp and his memory, as Ronan had hoped, was sharper. He listened to the whole situation from his rocking chair on the listing porch. And when Eliza finished, he sat quietly for a moment, rocking, looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man sorting through a filing cabinet that only he can access. I watered my father's cattle from that creek in the summer of 1858, he said finally, before Thomas's father took possession of Redstone Hollow, before Millhaven had a post office, before Bram Voss was tall enough to see over a fence rail. He stopped rocking. He came to me 3 years ago, wanted to buy my place. What did you tell him? Eliza said. Told him I'd eat the deed before I'd sell it to him. He resumed rocking. He smiled and rode away. I've been waiting for the next move ever since. He looked at Eliza over the rocking chair's arm. Looks like it came to you first. Will you testify? She said. Son, he said, to Ronan apparently, though Ronan was at least a decade older than the word suggested. Hand me that pen on the table inside. Ronan went in and came back with the pen and an ink bottle, and Harlan Grice signed Eliza's testimony paper with the careful signature of a man who still took penmanship seriously, and then handed it back and resumed rocking. You're going to need more than me, he said. I know, Eliza said. May Aldine. She's been here since '64. Her sheep have drunk from that creek every summer since. Her memory's good. He paused. She's also got less patience for Bram Voss than I do, which is saying something. May Aldine was 61, ran 400 sheep on the north slope with 2 dogs and 1 hired hand who appeared to be approximately 15 years old, and when Eliza rode up to her fence line, she was in the middle of a disagreement with a Iwi who had gotten her head through the fence and was disinclined to get it back out. May settled the ewe situation by direct physical persuasion and then leaned on the fence post, breathing slightly hard, and looked at Eliza. You're Thomas Harrow's wife, she said. Widow, Eliza said. Same thing, different tense. May looked at Ronan. Who's this? Ronan Vale. He works my ranch. May looked at him for a moment with the particular evaluative gaze of a woman who has been running her own operation alone for many years and has developed strong opinions about the quality of men. She said, which was apparently positive. Eliza explained the situation. May listened, and as she listened, her expression moved through several stages. First attention, then understanding, then a particular kind of quiet anger that doesn't make noise because it doesn't need to. He's been diverting water from the creek all along, May said when Eliza finished. Not a question. We believe so, yes. My upper pasture water has been low 3 summers out of the last 5, May said. I thought it was the dry cycles. I went and bought supplemental water twice. She pushed off the fence post. Twice I paid for water I should have had free, because that man was taking it upstream. She held out her hand for the testimony paper. Eliza gave it to her. May Aldine signed it in handwriting that was firm and slightly angry-looking, which seemed exactly right. On the 4th day, something shifted. Word was traveling. Eliza didn't know how exactly. It moved the way word moves in small valleys, person to person, at feed stores and church steps, and along fence lines where neighbors stopped to lean and talk. By the 4th day, people were seeking her out instead of the other way around. A man named Dutch Harker rode up to the ranch in the late afternoon and asked to speak with her and told her that Bram had, 2 years prior, arranged for a county assessor to resurvey the Harker property's eastern boundary in a way that cost Dutch 12 acres and had never been satisfactorily explained. Eliza added him to the list. A woman named Clara Faust, no relation to Bram, she specified this immediately and firmly, arrived the following morning with her teenage son and a handwritten account of watching Bram's men tear down a fence her late husband had built, claiming it crossed a line it had not, 2 weeks after her husband died, and 2 weeks before Bram made her an offer to buy her out. She had sold. She had no choice. She was not going to let that stop her from testifying. The evening of the 5th day, Eliza sat at the kitchen table with the testimony papers spread before her, 11 signatures, with more promised, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not victory, not safety. Something smaller and more durable than either. The feeling of not being alone. Ronan came in from the barn, washed his hands at the basin, and stood looking at the papers from the doorway. 11, she said. 14, he said. Harlan Grice talked to 2 families on the East Ridge. They sent word with me. They'll come to the hearing. She looked at the papers. 14 signatures. 14 people who had decided that being afraid of Bram Voss was not as important as being done with him. Is it enough? She said. I don't know, he said honestly. She appreciated that more than she would have appreciated a false reassurance. Sit down, she said. He sat. She poured 2 cups of coffee, fresh this time, and set one in front of him and sat across the table. I need to ask you something, she said. He waited. You said you know about territorial land surveys, that you've worked around them. She held her cup with both hands. How much do you know? He was quiet for a moment. Enough, he said. I worked 2 seasons as a junior surveyor's assistant, early 70s. Not licensed, not official, just learning. But I know how these hearings are structured. I know what a land agent is looking for and what order they want to see evidence presented. Then I need you to organize what we have, she said. Not just collect it, organize it. Make it tell the story in the right order. That's going to take some nights, he said. We have nights, she said. Over the next week, Ronan did something that Eliza watched with the specific admiration you feel for a person doing something they're genuinely good at. He sorted the testimony papers not by date received or by the signer's name, but by chronological relevance to the creek's history. He created a timeline, on paper, in a handwriting that was neater than she expected from a man who handled cattle for a living, showing the continuous use of the creek by Redstone Hollow stretching from 1863 forward. He matched each testimony to a specific point on the timeline. He found 2 additional documents in Thomas's records that she had missed, a water delivery receipt from 1871 and a letter from the territorial land agent of that era acknowledging Redstone Hollow's established water source. Neither was definitive on its own. Together with the testimony and the 1863 filing, they formed something that had a shape. Cutter, who had been watching this process from his chair by the stove with the quiet attention of an old man who knows more than he mentions, said one evening, "That's a real case." Ronan looked up from the papers. "It's a fighting case." "Same thing," Cutter said. "To the right judge." "It's not a judge," Ronan said. "It's a territorial land agent." "Same thing," Cutter repeated, which did not reflect a precise understanding of territorial hearing procedures, but reflected an admirable optimism. Then on the 8th day, the thing happened that Eliza had not seen coming. Bram came back. Not with men behind him this time, not with paperwork or lawyers or the particular brand of pleasantness that was his version of a weapon. He came alone in the early morning and tied his horse at the fence and walked to the porch and knocked. Actually knocked. Eliza opened the door. Bram looked older in the morning light than he looked in the afternoons and evenings when she had seen him before. She registered that, and also that he'd ridden alone, and also that he had not removed his hat. "I know what you've been doing," he said, "riding the valley, collecting statements." "Yes," she said. "You've been talking to people I have business relationships with," he said. The pleasantness was gone entirely, or rather it was thin enough now to see what was behind it, which was not rage but something closer to genuine frustration. The frustration of a man who cannot understand why a situation he has arranged carefully keeps not resolving itself the way arrangements should resolve. "I've been talking to your neighbors," she said, "who are also mine." "Mrs. Harrow." He said her name with a new weight in it. I'm trying to tell you something that you are not hearing. I don't lose hearings in this territory. I have relationships with the land office that go back 12 years. You can bring whatever statements you've collected, and it will not change the outcome. The only thing that changes is how much difficulty you go through before the difficulty ends. She stood in the doorway of her house. She was aware of Ronan's presence behind her, somewhere in the kitchen. She hadn't heard him move, but she knew he was there. You've been using that water, she said. Not just this summer, for years. Slowly, carefully, taking a little more each dry season until you had enough to make a formal claim. She watched his face. How many smaller ranchers paid for water or sold out because their pastures were drying and they couldn't figure out why? Bram said nothing. How many, Bram? His jaw tightened. You don't know what you're talking about. May Aldine bought water twice, she said. Walt Penbrook's south pasture was half dead 2 summers ago. Dutch Harker had to sell 20 head below market in August of '84 because his stock were losing weight from insufficient water. She kept her voice even. I'm going to tell all of that to the land agent, and I'm going to have a signed statement from every single person I just named. The silence between them was the kind that has weight in it, real physical weight you can feel pressing against your ribs. You're making an enemy, Bram said quietly. You made yourself my enemy, she said. The morning you walked into my kitchen and put a paper on my table. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her. She didn't turn, but she knew what he was looking at. Your man, Bram said. The quiet one. Eliza said nothing. Where'd you find him? Bram said. He found me, she said. Bram nodded slowly, like something was making sense to him. Well, he said. He replaced his hat, which had been in his hand, without her noticing him remove it. I suppose we'll let the territorial office sort it out. I suppose we will, she said. He went back to his horse, unhitched it, and rode north without looking back. Eliza turned into the kitchen. Ronan was at the table with a cup of coffee and the testimony papers and an expression that was giving nothing away. How much of that did you hear? She said. All of it, he said. The door's not that thick. She sat down across from him. She felt unsteady in a way she didn't want to show, the way you feel after a conversation where you said the true thing and it cost something to say it. He came to intimidate me, she said. He came to assess you, Ronan said. See if you'd hold. Did I? Ronan looked at her across the table. What do you think? She picked up his coffee and took a sip because hers was on the other side of the kitchen, and she didn't feel like getting up for it. He didn't comment. I think we need to practice, she said. The testimony, the order of presentation. I've never stood in front of a land agent and argued for my own property. Then we practice, he said. Every evening this week. She set his cup back down. You've done this before? Argued a hearing? I've watched it done, he said. Several times. It's not court. It's organized conversation with someone who has the authority to decide. What they're looking for is clarity and consistency. Bram's lawyers are going to present a coherent story. You need a coherent story. Tell me mine, she said. He straightened the papers in front of him. Redstone Hollow has used the creek as its primary water source since 1863. The use has been continuous, documented, and witnessed across 23 years by multiple valley residents predating Bram Voss's acquisition of the upstream parcel. The diversion gate represents an active attempt to undermine established water rights rather than the exercise of legitimate new ones. He said it cleanly, without hesitation, like a man who had been thinking it through for days. That's the story, he said. Everything else is evidence for that story. She looked at him across the table in the kitchen of the house Thomas had built, with the morning light coming through the window and the coffee going cold, and the papers spread between them like a map of the fight they were in. And she thought about a man who had lost everything he'd built and spent years since making sure he wouldn't have to feel that again. She thought about what it had cost him to still be sitting at this table. Ronan, she said. He looked up. Whatever happens at the hearing, she said, I want you to know I'm glad you were at that fence when you rode up. Whatever your reasons. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his expression that wasn't quite readable. Not the stillness, something under it. Something that stillness was in the habit of covering. So am I, he said. She nodded once and picked up her own coffee from across the kitchen and brought it back to the table. and they sat there in the morning quiet, going over the testimony papers one more time, looking for the holes before Bram's lawyers could find them first. The days between then and the hearing moved in the contradictory way that days move when you're dreading a fixed point, both too fast and too slow, so that you never feel adequately prepared and also feel that you have been preparing forever. Twice more, small confrontations happened at the edges. One of Bram's men rode the Redstone Hollow fence line close enough to be making a point, and Pete Dunner rode out to ask him his business, and the man said he had none and rode on. The second time, someone cut the southwest fence at a corner post, just 2 wire strands, enough to let 4 steers through onto the open range east of the property. Ronan and Cal spent a morning finding the steers and another morning repairing the fence. Ronan said nothing about who had cut it. He didn't need to. The night before the hearing, Eliza could not sleep. She lay in the dark in the room that still had Thomas's reading lamp on his side of the bed because she had not moved it, and she looked at the ceiling and she thought about the 1863 document and the 14 signatures and the story Ronan had told her to tell. And she also thought about Bram Voss's face in the morning light when he said, "You're making an enemy." And she also thought about a Wyoming drought and a 28-year-old man who had lost everything and spent the next 8 years moving. And she thought about the specific quality of his stillness and why. Of all the things he could have told her about himself, the first thing he chose to tell her was that he didn't own anything anymore, because you can't lose what you don't own. She lay there in the dark and thought about what it meant to be afraid of the wrong thing for long enough that the fear became its own kind of prison, with walls smooth enough that you could tell yourself you weren't imprisoned at all. She got up at 4 in the morning and started coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the testimony papers one last time, not to read them, she knew them, but for the same reason some people need to hold a thing to believe it's real. Ronan came in at 4:15, dressed, hat in hand. He looked at her at the table and didn't look surprised. He sat down across from her. "Couldn't sleep either?" she said. "I sleep fine," he said. "I just wake up early when something matters." She looked at him across the table. "Does this matter to you?" she said. "I mean, really, beyond the work." He held her gaze for a longer moment than he usually let himself. "Yes," he said. She nodded. They drank their coffee in the early dark without speaking much, and after a while Cutter came in, and then Pete and Cal, and the house filled with the sounds of morning, and by 5:30 they were saddled, and by 6 they were riding the road to Mill Haven, 14 signatures in a leather case behind Eliza's saddle, the mountains clear and cold and sharp against the first light, the creek, barely running, just barely, catching the early sun to their east. Whatever was going to happen in that hearing room was going to happen. Eliza Harrow had done everything she could think to do. Now it was time to find out if it was enough. The Territorial Land Office in Mill Haven was not an impressive building. It was a single-story structure of weathered pine boards on the north end of the main street, wedged between a harness repair shop on one side and a building that had been a saloon, then a dry goods store, and was currently in the process of becoming something else undecided. The sign above the door read, "Territorial Land and Water Administration," in letters that had once been black and were now closer to dark gray, bleached by several years of Montana sun that didn't care much for signage. Eliza had ridden past it dozens of times without going in. She tied her horse at the rail outside and stood for a moment looking at the door. Behind her, Ronan dismounted and Cutter came down from the wagon he'd driven in with Pete and Cal, moving carefully on his hip, saying nothing because Cutter had the good sense to understand that some moments don't need commentary. The street was quiet for a Tuesday morning, not empty. A feed wagon was parked 2 buildings down, and a woman in a gray dress was crossing toward the dry goods, but quieter than usual, as though the town itself was aware something was happening today and had decided to give it space. Then Eliza turned and saw what was coming down the south road. Walt Penbrook was first, riding beside his wife June, who had apparently decided to come despite not being a named witness. Behind them came Harlan Grice in a buckboard driven by a young man she didn't recognize, probably a neighbor's son drafted into driving duty. May Aldine came alone on a stout gray horse that matched her general disposition, Dutch Harker and his eldest son, Clara Foss and her teenage boy. 3 other families she recognized and 2 she didn't quite, people who had heard and come anyway. 14 signatures, most of them in person. She had asked them to send statements. She had not asked them to come. She looked at Ronan. "You knew," she said. "Harlan mentioned it might happen," he said, in the tone of a man who had done considerably more than allow something to happen. May Aldine pulled up her gray horse and looked down at Eliza. "You didn't think we'd let you do this alone." You thought wrong," May said, and dismounted. They went inside. The hearing room was the back 2/3 of the building, a long rectangular space with 3 rows of chairs facing a raised table where the land agent would sit. The table had a territorial seal on a mounted board behind it that was slightly crooked, which had apparently been that way long enough that no one considered fixing it anymore. 2 kerosene lamps supplemented the pale light coming through 2 narrow windows on the east wall. Bram Voss was already there. He had 3 men with him. 2. Eliza didn't know, and one she recognized as a Millhaven lawyer named Gantry, who had handled property disputes in the valley for years and had a reputation for preparation and a near-total absence of warmth. Gantry was in his late 40s, thin, with the kind of careful tidiness that signals a man who understands how appearances work in official settings. He was sorting papers on the left side of the front row when they came in, and he looked up and registered the crowd filing in behind Eliza, and then looked at Bram, and Bram looked at the crowd, and something passed between them that Eliza caught only the edge of. It wasn't alarm, not quite, but it was a recalibration. She had seen that expression on Bram's face before, the morning he first knocked on her porch door. She took the right side of the front row and set the leather case with the testimony papers on the chair beside her. Ronan sat on her other side. Behind them, the valley's people filed into chairs and along the walls with the particular quiet purposefulness of people who have gotten up early and ridden a distance and intend to be here for the duration. The land agent arrived at 9 o'clock. His name was Gerald Purvis. He was perhaps 55, with a wide forehead and reading glasses he kept on a cord around his neck, and he came in from a side door carrying a leather satchel that clinked with the sound of official stamps and document seals. He set the satchel on the table and looked at both sides of the room and then at the people standing along the walls, and an expression crossed his face that Eliza interpreted as mild surprise, carefully controlled into professional neutrality. "This is a water rights evidentiary hearing," he said, setting out his papers. "Claimant is Bram Voss, represented by counsel Gantry, asserting management rights over the tributary creek running through sections 14 and 15. Respondent is Mrs. Eliza Harrow of Redstone Hollow Ranch, asserting established prior water rights." He settled his glasses on his nose and looked up. "We'll hear from the claimant first, then the respondent. Questions from me throughout. This is not a court of law, but it is a proceeding of record. Speak clearly, speak honestly, and speak to the matter at hand." He paused. "Mr. Gantry." Gantry stood. He was smooth. There was no other word that fit as well. He laid out Bram's claim in exactly the organized, sequential, confident manner of a man who has done this many times and knows the territory of an argument the way a surveyor knows land. Every boundary, every weakness, every place where ground looks solid but isn't. He presented the survey of Bram's upstream parcel showing the creek's origin point on Voss property. He presented a water flow assessment from the prior year suggesting the creek's primary source was within Bram's boundaries. He presented a legal opinion from a territorial water attorney in Helena, arguing that primary source management constituted a valid basis for water rights filing. It was 20 minutes of very competent work. Eliza sat through it with her hands in her lap and her face arranged carefully, listening not just to what was being said, but to how it was structured, looking for the places where the argument had weight and the places where it leaned on assumption rather than fact. Ronan had told her to listen for those places. "The argument sounds solid until you find where it's hollow," he'd said. "Every argument has a hollow place." She found 2. When Gantry sat, Purvis looked at Eliza. "Mrs. Harrow, your response." She stood. She had practiced this. Alone in the kitchen before dawn, with Ronan across the table timing her, and asking the hard questions so Purvis's questions would feel easier by comparison. She knew what she was going to say, and she knew the order, and she knew where the documents were in the leather case. But standing in front of the table with Bram Voss 6 feet to her left, and a room full of people behind her, and Gerald Purvis watching her over his reading glasses, she felt something she hadn't expected. Not fear. She had been afraid for months and knew what that felt like. This was something closer to grief, sudden and specific. The feeling that Thomas should be here, that this was his fight first and hers by terrible inheritance, and that she was standing in a government building arguing for land he had never thought he'd leave behind, and she had never thought she'd be defending alone. She let the feeling come and held it for exactly 3 seconds. She could feel them passing. And then she set it aside because she couldn't afford it right now, and Thomas would have said the same. "Mr. Purvis," she said, "Redstone Hollow Ranch has drawn water from the tributary creek running through sections 14 and 15 as its primary source since 1863. That use has been continuous, documented, and witnessed across 23 years. I have here a filing from the Territorial Land Office of that year, signed by the land agent of that era and my late husband's father, establishing Redstone Hollow's water source." She removed it from the case and set it on the table. "I also have a water delivery receipt from 1871, an agent's acknowledgement letter from the same period, and signed testimony from 14 Valley residents establishing continuous use." She set the documents on the table one by one as she named them. "Mr. Voss purchased his upstream parcel in 1878, she said, 15 years after Redstone Hollow's documented use was established. His management claim is based on a source survey from last year, 16 years after his own acquisition, and 23 years after Redstone Hollow's prior use was recorded." She looked at Purvis. "Prior continuous use predates his purchase, his claim, and his management survey. And I have 14 people in this room who can confirm it." The silence after she finished was the kind you can feel the shape of. Purvis looked at the document she had set on his table. He picked up the 1863 filing first, which was the one she'd most wanted him to pick up first. He read it with the careful attention of a man who does this for a living and knows what he's looking at. Gantry said, "Mr. Purvis, the age of a document doesn't establish continuous use. Use patterns change over time. What Mrs. Harrow has established is that someone used this water source in 1863. That's 23 years ago. The question is what happened in between." 14 witnesses, Eliza said quietly. "That's what happened in between." Purvis held up a hand. "Mrs. Harrow, we'll proceed in order. Mr. Gantry, I take your point. Mrs. Harrow, call your first witness." Harlan Grice came forward. He walked slowly because his body moved slowly now. But he sat in the chair beside Purvis's table with a straightness that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the particular dignity of a man who knows exactly what he's saying and why. Purvis asked him to state his history in the valley, and Harlan Grice told it. 74 years old, 52 years in the valley, had first used the creek in question in 1858, before it had a recorded name on any territorial survey, and had watched Redstone Hollow's use of it continuously from the day Thomas Harrow's father drove the first post of the original fence line. "Every year?" Purvis asked. "Every summer I can account for," Harlan said, "which is most of them." "You have specific memory of specific years?" Harlan fixed Purvis with a look that suggested he had not driven 30 minutes in a buckboard to have his memory questioned. "I remember the summer of 1869 because it was the first dry summer and Thomas's father asked me if I thought the creek would hold. I told him I'd never seen it go dry, and it didn't. I remember 1874 because 3 Harrow cattle wandered onto my property, and Thomas himself came to collect them, and we stood at the creek fence for an hour talking about the price of beef." He paused. "I remember most years because something happened in most years. That's what years are for." A small sound moved through the people in the chairs behind Eliza. Not quite laughter, something warmer. Gantry cross-questioned Harlan for 12 minutes. He was respectful. You didn't disrespect a man of 74 in front of a room full of people who all knew him, but he pressed on the specifics, looking for the places where memory became approximation and approximation became uncertainty. Harlan held. When Harlan was done, May Aldine came forward. She had changed into her better dress for the occasion, which was the same cut as her everyday dress but in a darker blue, and she sat in the chair like she sat on her own porch fence, as though the chair was there as a courtesy she didn't particularly need. She testified about 23 years of watching the creek feed her upper pasture and Redstone Hollow's lower fields, and about the 2 summers she'd bought supplemental water when her pasture levels dropped without explanation, and about the summer she'd noticed the low water and ridden upstream and found the beginnings of what she now understood to be the early version of the diversion gate, though at the time she'd thought it was flood-damaged debris. When was that? Purvis asked. Summer of 1883, she said. Purvis wrote something. Eliza could not see what. Gantry stood. Mrs. Aldine, you're saying you saw debris in the creek in 1883. You're now characterizing that debris as an early diversion structure. That seems like quite a leap of interpretation. May looked at him the way she'd looked at the ewe stuck in the fence. I was describing what I saw, she said. You're the one interpreting it. I described it as what it looked like to me at the time, which was debris. I'm telling you now, having seen the structure that stands there presently, that the arrangement of what I saw in 83 looked very similar. But you didn't know it was a diversion. No, she said. I didn't know. Now I do. That's how knowing works. You learn it eventually. Another sound in the room. Purvis hid something with his hand that might have been the beginning of a smile. Walt Penbrook was next. Then Dutch Harker. Then Clara Foss, who sat in the chair and spoke with the precise, controlled voice of a woman who has been frightened for years and has finally decided that being frightened is less useful than being clear. She described her husband's fence, the resurvey that had cost them 12 acres, the offer that came 2 weeks after her husband died, the sale she had been maneuvered into. Gantry objected twice. Purvis allowed both pieces of testimony to stand, noting that patterns of conduct were relevant to questions of intent. Bram Voss sat through all of it without changing expression. He was good at that. Eliza had to give him that. He had the practiced stillness of a man who has been in many rooms where people said things about him and had learned not to give them the satisfaction of a visible reaction. But his lawyer was writing notes with increasing frequency, and once, between witnesses, she saw Gantry lean close to Bram and say something in a low voice, and Bram listened and gave a very small, tight nod. He had not expected this many people. She could see that understanding settling into him like water into dry ground. After 6 witnesses, Purvis called a brief recess. Eliza walked to the back of the room, and Ronan was beside her immediately. She could feel the strain in her own face, not distress exactly, more the physical cost of maintaining composure for several hours in a small room with high stakes. You're doing well, he said quietly. Tell me what he's thinking, she said. Purvis? Ronan glanced toward the front table where Purvis was reviewing documents. He's reading the 1863 filing again, he said. He's been back to it 3 times. Is that good? It means it's the thing that matters most to him, which it should be. He paused. When we go back in, I want you to make sure the timeline document goes up, the one I drew up connecting each testimony to each year. You think he'll ask for it? I think if you don't offer it, he'll have to ask for it, and it's better to offer it. She nodded. Gantry is going to push hard on Clara Foss. He already is, but she didn't fold. No, Eliza said. She didn't. She looked at the room, at Walt Penbrook talking quietly with Dutch Harker, at Harlan Grice sitting with his eyes closed in a posture that looked like sleep but probably wasn't, at May Aldine standing near the wall with her arms folded, watching Gantry across the room with an expression of mild contempt. These people didn't have to come, she said. No, Ronan said. They're here because of what Bram did to them, not just what he did to me. Some of both, he said. Don't shortchange your part of it. She looked at him. What do you mean? He was quiet a moment. You went to them. You asked directly. You showed them it was possible to fight. He met her eyes. Some people need to see someone else pick up the first stone before they can believe the throwing is possible. She absorbed that. The recess bell, which was actually Purvis tapping his stamp handle on the table, called them back. The afternoon session was harder. Gantry had restructured his approach during the recess. He abandoned the direct confrontation with individual witnesses. He'd seen that wasn't working, and instead began attacking the evidentiary standard itself. He argued that testimony of recollection, however numerous, did not constitute documented continuous use in the legal sense required for prior rights establishment. He quoted 2 territorial precedents, both from Helena decisions, that he said supported that interpretation. Purvis listened to this carefully. He asked Gantry to cite the case references, which Gantry did from prepared notes. Eliza felt something shift under the hearing the way ground sometimes shifts under your feet in soft earth. Not dramatically, just enough to remind you it can. She looked at Ronan. He was already leaning slightly forward, and she knew that expression. It was the expression he had when he was working through something, the kind of focused internal attention that he usually kept invisible. She leaned toward him. "What is he doing?" she whispered. "Narrowing the definition," Ronan said quietly. "If he can get Purvis to adopt a strict documentary standard, the testimony becomes supporting evidence instead of primary evidence. Then it's our 3 documents against their source survey and legal opinion. And? And that's a closer case." "How much closer?" He didn't answer immediately. "Ronan." "Close enough that I'd want to shore it up," he said. She looked at the front table. Purvis was writing. The room was quiet except for Gantry's continued argument and the occasional shift of someone in a chair. "What shores it up?" she said. "The water delivery receipt from 1871, he said. "It has a territorial agent countersignature on the back. I noticed it last night, but I didn't think it was the most important piece." He paused. "If Gantry is arguing documentary standard, that countersignature is documentary evidence of agency acknowledgement. It's not just a receipt. It's a recorded transaction involving the territorial water system." "Tell me what to say." "Show Purvis the back," he said. "Point to the countersignature. Ask him to confirm the signatory's role." Purvis turned from Gantry. "Mrs. Harrow, do you have a response to the evidentiary standard argument?" She stood. "Yes, sir," she said. "I'd like to draw your attention to the reverse of the 1871 water delivery receipt, if you haven't already looked at it." Purvis picked up the receipt and turned it over. His expression didn't change, but he looked at it for a longer moment than any of the other documents. "Can you identify the countersignatory?" she said. Purvis read the back. "It appears to be a notation from the Assistant Territorial Water Register." He looked up. "This is a recorded transaction." "Yes, sir," she said. "Which means Redstone Hollow's water use was registered with the territorial system in 1871, 12 years prior to Mr. Voss's upstream acquisition and 15 years prior to Mr. Voss's diversion construction. The quiet that followed was different from the earlier quiet. It had more density to it. Gantry was on his feet. "Mr. Purvis, a routine register notation doesn't constitute—" "Mr. Gantry," Purvis said, not loudly, "I'll determine what it constitutes." He looked at the receipt again. He looked at the 1863 filing. He set both of them side by side on the table in front of him with the careful deliberateness of a man organizing his thinking into physical space. Eliza sat back down. Under the table, she pressed her hands flat against her thighs, which were shaking slightly. Not visibly, but she could feel it. The specific trembling of the body after sustained tension. Ronan didn't look at her. He was watching Purvis. She watched him watching Purvis and tried to read what he was reading, and couldn't. Purvis called 3 more of Eliza's witnesses. Each one added something specific to the timeline Ronan had built. A year, a detail, a particular incident that anchored the creek's use to a date and a person and a witnessed moment. An old homesteader named Whitmore, who had settled a quarter-mile from the creek in 1866 and had used Redstone Hollow land as a reference point for his own surveys, said something that Eliza hadn't anticipated. "I used the Harrow Creek marker in my own property filing," Whitmore said. "The water source at Redstone Hollow was so established by 1866 that the surveyor I hired used it as a fixed reference point. It was considered a permanent feature of the valley by the people mapping it." Purvis looked up. "A fixed reference point in a property survey?" "Yes, sir. My original 1866 deed survey. I have the document at home." "I'd like to see that," Purvis said. "I can have it here by Friday," Whitmore said, which meant the hearing wasn't concluding today. Gantry objected to the delay. Purvis overruled. At 3:30, Purvis closed the day's session and told both parties the hearing would continue Friday to allow for the additional document and any final statements. He gathered his papers without indicating which direction his thinking was running, because that was his job and he was good at it. People began moving toward the door. The room that had been tight and official expanded and loosened with the release of held breath, and people who had been sitting in careful silence started talking to each other in the normal human voices they'd been suppressing for hours. Eliza stood and gathered her documents back into the leather case, and when she looked up, Clara Foss was standing in front of her. Clara was perhaps 45, thin in a way that had not always been the case, with hands that showed the kind of work that doesn't stop because a husband dies. She looked at Eliza for a moment without speaking. "My husband would have come himself," she said finally. If he were here. Eliza looked at her. What you did today was enough, she said. More than enough. Clara nodded once, not easily, the way people nod when something is genuinely hard, and went out. Walt Pembroke stopped beside her and said only, Friday, which meant he would be back. May Aldine said, passing, that water receipt was smart. That was Ronan, Eliza said. May paused and looked at Ronan, who was standing behind Eliza gathering the last of the papers. She looked at him with the same evaluating expression she'd used at her fence that first day. She said again, and went out. Bram left without speaking to Eliza. He passed within 6 feet of her on his way to the door and looked straight ahead, which was a choice she noticed and logged. Not contempt, not defeat. Something more controlled than either. The expression of a man who is reserving his next move. Gantry was the last of Bram's group to leave, and as he passed the table where Eliza was standing, he stopped and looked at the leather case in her hands. Mrs. Harrow, he said, that water receipt was a strong piece of evidence. She waited, because a compliment from opposing counsel was not a compliment. Mr. Voss has the resources to appeal a finding to the Helena Territorial Court, he said. I want to be straightforward with you about that. Even a favorable finding here is not necessarily a final finding. I appreciate the straightforwardness, she said. Is that a threat? Gantry looked mildly surprised. Not at the question, she thought, but at the directness of it. It's a fact, he said. The same way the water receipt is a fact. Then we'll deal with Helena if it comes to that, she said. Gantry looked at her for another moment, then nodded once and left. The room was empty except for Eliza, Ronan, and Cutter, who had sat in the back row all day without moving much and had apparently slept through 2 of the witnesses, which he denied. You didn't sleep? Eliza said. I rested my eyes, Cutter said with dignity. She looked at the room, the crooked territorial seal, the 2 narrow windows with the afternoon light coming through them at a low angle, the chairs still slightly rearranged from where people had shifted during the testimony. We didn't win, she said. Not yet, Ronan said. Gantry just told me Bram can take it to Helena. I know. That would have taken months, money I don't have. I know that too. He didn't try to minimize it. She stood in the empty room and looked at the table where Purvis had sat with her documents and Bram's documents and the particular difficult weight of deciding something that would change someone's life. What did you think? She said. When Purvis read the receipt, what did you actually think? Ronan was quiet for a moment. I thought we had a real chance, not a certain one. He looked at her. I've never told you this would be certain. I know you haven't. But I think it's real, he said. The 1863 filing, the register notation, Whitmore's survey reference. If Purvis applies prior use doctrine, he can't get around 23 years of documented, witnessed, registered continuous use. He paused. Unless he wants to, which would be a different problem. Do you think he wants to? Ronan considered it honestly. No, he said. He's been a fair man today. He let your witnesses speak. He read the documents. He asked for Whitmore's deed. He picked up his hat from the chair back. A man who wants to bury the evidence doesn't ask for more of it. She nodded. She was tired in a way that had settled into her bones. Not the tired of physical work, which she was used to, but the tired of sustained alertness in a high-stakes situation, which took something from a different reserve and left it slower to refill. They went outside. The street was quiet in the late afternoon. Most of the valley people had already headed home. They had animals to get back to, which was the fundamental truth of ranching life, that the animals did not take days off because you were involved in a legal proceeding. Harlan Grice's buckboard was still tied up the street, and she could see Harlan in conversation with old Whitmore, the 2 men leaning on the wagon talking with the economy of people who have known each other long enough that they don't need a lot of words. Cutter went to check the horses. Eliza stood on the boardwalk outside the land office with the leather case under her arm and let the late afternoon air touch her face, which was cooler than it had been at noon and smelled like it might be working up toward rain by evening. After a moment, Ronan said, You did something today. She looked at him. You made them stand up, he said. All those people. They came here today and said things they had been not saying for years, and that happened because you went to their doors and asked them directly. He was not looking at her but at the street, which was his way sometimes of saying something that mattered. That doesn't go away. Whatever Purvis decides, whatever Bram does in Helena, that doesn't go away. You changed something in this valley today. She stood beside him on the boardwalk in the cooling afternoon and thought about what he'd said. She thought about Clara Foss's hands, and Walt Penbrook's 8 feet, and May Aldine buying water she should have had free, and the specific quality of the room when 14 people who had been separately afraid found out they were afraid of the same thing together, which is a different condition entirely. She thought about Thomas, the way she often did at the end of hard days, not with the raw grief of the early months, which had been like a wound that didn't know yet that it was a wound, but with the more settled feeling of someone who misses a person and has learned to miss them in motion, to carry the missing while still moving. Thomas would have liked Ronan. She was almost certain of that. She was less certain what Thomas would have thought of the way she'd been thinking about Ronan lately, but Thomas had been a practical man and a fair one, and she suspected he would have found a way to understand it. "There's something I want to tell you," she said. Ronan looked at her. She almost said it. She was very close to saying it. The thing that had been present in the space between them for weeks now, growing more specific and more undeniable with each passing day, each late night at the kitchen table, each moment when his judgment had been sound and his presence had been steadying, and she had been grateful in a way that had quietly become something other than gratitude. But Cutter came back with the horses at exactly that moment, and the timing closed something that had been briefly open, and she took her horse's reins and put her foot in the stirrup. "Friday," she said. "Friday," Ronan said. The ride home was quiet in the way that follows full days, when people are thinking rather than talking, and the conversation that happens is the one inside rather than between them. The sky to the west had gone the particular red-orange that precedes rain, and by the time they reached the Redstone Hollow gate, the first drops were coming down. Not heavy, just the opening remarks of a storm finding its pace. She led her horse to the barn, and Ronan led his, and they unsaddled in the lamplight of the barn without much talk, the rain picking up against the roof above them. The particular comfort of the barn smell, hay and horses and old wood, surrounding them in the way it does when it's raining outside and you are inside and the animals are settled. She hung her saddle and looked at the mare, Thomas's impossible mare, who had become something like a dependable animal over the past 2 months, who stood in her stall now with both eyes soft and her weight easy. She thought about what Ronan had said to her the first day he worked with that mare. "She's not mean. She's just been handled wrong." She had been thinking about that sentence at odd intervals ever since, applying it to things it wasn't specifically about. She turned and found Ronan closer than she expected, reaching past her for the saddle hook on the wall. He stopped when she turned. They were 2 feet apart in the lamplight, with the rain coming hard now on the roof, and the horses were quiet, and the barn was warm with the heat of animals at rest. She looked at him. She had been going to say something outside the land office before Cutter came back. "When this is over," she said, "when Friday comes and goes and whatever Purvis decides is decided, I want to talk." His expression was careful. "About what?" She held his gaze. "About things that aren't the ranch." The careful expression shifted. Not much. With Ronan, it was never much. But enough. "All right," he said. She went out through the rain to the house, and she didn't look back, and she could feel the particular quality of the night behind her, which was the quality of a night when things have been said without quite being said, which is sometimes the most honest conversation there is. Inside, she built up the stove and changed out of her good clothes and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and the remaining 3 days between her and Friday. 3 days to wait. She had waited 8 months. She could wait 3 more days. But she also knew, sitting there in the warm kitchen with the rain building outside and the ranch quiet around her, that some things are harder to be patient about than water rights, and that whatever happened in that hearing room on Friday, some questions already had their answers and had had them for a while, and were just waiting for a quiet enough moment to be spoken aloud. The 3 days between Tuesday and Friday were not quiet days. She had expected them to be, had imagined, in the exhausted optimism of the ride home through the rain, that the valley would settle into a kind of waiting stillness while Purvis reviewed his documents and the hearing moved toward its conclusion. She had been wrong about that. The valley did not settle. If anything, it became more agitated in the way that water becomes more agitated when something large and invisible moves beneath the surface. Wednesday morning, Pete Dunner came in from the eastern fence line with news that 3 more wire strands had been cut overnight, Different section than before, longer stretch. Cal had already ridden out to assess the damage. Ronan heard the report from Pete and went directly to the barn without eating breakfast. "How bad?" Eliza said, following him. 2 hours of repair minimum, he said, saddling his horse with the efficient motions of a man who has stopped being surprised by a situation. "Probably 3. This is Bram." "It's somebody who wants us distracted from Friday," he said, not answering her directly, but also not disagreeing. She stood in the barn doorway. The morning was clear after the rain, the mountains showing sharp against a pale blue sky in a way that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. "He's trying to drain us before the final hearing." "Or he's making a point," Ronan said, "showing us what he can do even while the hearing is open." He looked at her over his horse's back. Both can be true. She didn't ride out to the fence that morning. She wanted to because standing still while someone else dealt with the problem was the thing she had always been worst at. But Ronan was right that one of them needed to stay at the ranch, and she had letters to write, to old Whitmore confirming the Friday proceeding, to the Valley families who had testified Tuesday, to the Millhaven supply merchant who was carrying a 60-day debt that she needed to acknowledge in writing before it became a problem of a different kind. She sat at the kitchen table and wrote for 3 hours and tried not to watch the clock. Ronan came back at midday with his shirt cuffed up and dirt on both forearms and the expression of a man who has done physical work on insufficient sleep. He washed at the basin without speaking for a moment. "Fixed?" she said. "Fixed," he said. "Cal's going to ride that line twice a day until Friday." "And after Friday?" He dried his hands and looked at her. "Depends what Friday brings." She held his gaze. He was right. It depended on Friday. Everything depended on Friday, which was the problem with putting all of something this important into a single day's outcome. Single outcomes. She had built it on sustained effort, on the accumulation of small decisions that added up to something large. And yet here she was. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make you something." He sat. She made eggs and bread and coffee and set them in front of him without ceremony, the way people in working households feed each other, practically without making a production of it. He ate. She sat across from him with her own cup and the letter to Whitmore half finished beside her. "Tell me something," she said. He looked up. "Not about the fence or the hearing or Bram," she said. "Just tell me something else." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding, sorting through the available material of himself for something that wasn't the immediate crisis. "I had a dog in Wyoming," he said finally. "Before everything went, good dog, border collie, half the time smarter than the men I hired." He paused. "When the bank came to take the property, I wasn't there. I was in town trying to arrange an extension that didn't get arranged. When I came back, the property was locked and the dog was on the porch." He turned his cup in his hands. "She had been sitting on that porch since I'd left that morning. Wouldn't go with the bankmen. Wouldn't leave." He stopped. "I had to find a family for her because I didn't know where I was going next and I couldn't take her with me. That was the worst part of the whole thing." Eliza looked at him across the table. Not with pity, which she knew he wouldn't want. With the particular attention of someone who recognizes a real thing being said. "What was her name?" she said. "Rue," he said. "Good name. She deserved better than I could give her at the time." She sat with that for a moment. Outside, a wind had come up after the rain, moving through the grass with a sound like distant water, which was a sound this valley made often and which she had always liked. "You've been carrying that a long time," she said. "I carry it light now," he said. "But yes, a while." She nodded. She understood the specific weight of things you can't fix retroactively, things you did or didn't do when the circumstances were wrong, that stay with you not because you were a bad person, but because you were a person in a bad moment, and the two are hard to separate even years later. She finished her letter to Whitmore. Ronan finished his eggs. The day moved through the rest of itself without major incident, which felt almost suspicious given the context, but she had learned not to complain about peace when it arrived. Thursday was worse. She was in the kitchen at 7 in the morning when she heard horses on the road. Not one horse, several. And when she went to the door, Bram Voss was riding up the ranch road with Gantry beside him and 2 other men behind. Not his ranch hands this time. The other men were wearing the kind of clothes that meant official business. Not quite formal, but intentional. She stood on the porch and waited. Bram came to the porch steps and stopped his horse. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, which was something close to conciliation, or at least a good performance of it. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, "I'd like to speak with you before tomorrow." "Then speak," she said. He dismounted, took his time, deliberate, and came to the foot of the steps. Gantry stayed on his horse. The two men in official-looking clothes stayed back. "I want to offer you a different arrangement," Bram said. "Not a purchase. I understand you're not going to sell, and frankly, after Tuesday, I respect that more than I might have otherwise." He paused, and she noticed that this version of Bram was more careful than the previous versions. The words chosen more precisely, the charm slightly subdued in favor of something that wanted to pass for sincerity. "I'm proposing a shared water agreement. Formal, registered, binding both parties. Your established use is protected. I maintain my management claims upstream. We define specific draw limits for each property, and neither party can alter them without consent of the other." Eliza looked at him. "Why?" "Because it's sensible," he said. "Because a prolonged hearing that goes to Helena costs both of us. Because—" "Why now?" she said. "Why Thursday morning?" Bram's mouth closed for a moment. He looked at her with something that might have been genuine respect beneath the surface of the negotiation. "Because Tuesday changed the calculation," he said. "I won't pretend otherwise. You brought people I didn't expect and evidence I didn't fully anticipate, and I'm enough of a realistic man to recognize when something has shifted." She stood on the porch and looked at him standing at the foot of her steps. This man who had pushed paper across her kitchen table 9 months ago and told her to sign, who had built a diversion gate in the night and filed a claim against her water and sent his men to cut her fence in the dark, who was now standing here in the morning sun, making what was by the standards of Bram Voss a remarkably gracious offer. She thought about what Gantry had said Tuesday. He can take it to Helena. Months. Money she didn't have. She thought about Ronan's voice saying, "A fighting chance is different from a certain one." She thought about 14 people who had driven and ridden to that hearing room and said true things. She said, "I need to discuss it." "Of course," Bram said. I'd expect nothing less." "Come back at 2 o'clock, she said. "I'll have an answer." He nodded. He went back to his horse and mounted and rode out with Gantry and the two official-looking men, and she watched them go until they turned onto the north road. Then she went to find Ronan. He was at the south pasture checking the water level in the secondary trough, which had been low since the diversion reduced the creek's flow. He heard her coming and turned, and she told him what had happened, the whole thing, standing in the morning sun by the trough, while a dozen cattle watched them with the profound indifference of cattle. When she finished, he was quiet for longer than usual. "Say what you're thinking," she said. "I'm thinking about why Thursday," he said. "Not Monday, not Wednesday. Thursday." He said Tuesday changed the calculation, yes, Ronan said, but he had Wednesday to decide that. He came Thursday morning, 1 day before the final hearing, 1 day before Whitmore's deed survey gets entered into record. He looked at her. That deed survey is the thing he's most worried about. She absorbed that. Because it places Redstone Hollow's water use as a fixed reference point in an 1866 property survey. "Which is not just testimony," Ronan said. "It's a document generated by a professional surveyor that treats the creek use as established fact. If Purvis sees that alongside the 1863 filing and the register notation, the evidentiary case is airtight." He paused. "Bram knows that. Or Gantry does, which is the same thing. So the offer is to avoid Friday." "The offer is to avoid losing on Friday," Ronan said. "There's a difference." She looked at the trough. The water level was low, maybe a third of what it should be. The cattle had been managing, but barely. "Is the offer worth taking?" He looked at her directly. "What does it give you?" "Protected established use, defined draw limits, legal registration." "And what does it give him?" She thought. "Management claims upstream, formal recognition that he has some standing over the source." "Which he currently doesn't have," Ronan said. "Not legally. If Purvis rules for you tomorrow, Bram has no management claim. He has upstream property and the water runs through it, but your established prior use overrides any claim he can make." He let that sit for a moment. A shared agreement gives him something the hearing might not. She felt the shape of it clearly. "He's asking me to settle for half of what I might win in full." Yes, but if I don't settle and Purvis rules partially, or if it goes to Helena, then the settlement looks better in comparison, Ronan said. He's buying uncertainty with this offer, selling you the idea that half is better than the risk of nothing. She stood very still for a moment. A cattle egret landed on the far end of the trough and looked at them without interest. What would you do? She said. Ronan looked at her steadily. I'd go to Friday. Even with the Helena risk. Even with that, he said. Because the Whitmore deed is real, and the register notation is real, and you have 14 people who sat in those chairs and told the truth. If Purvis is a fair man, and I think he is, the case makes itself. He paused. And because if you accept a shared agreement with Bram Voss, you are in a legal arrangement with Bram Voss, every dry summer for the rest of your life. That was the thing she had been circling without landing on it. The legal entanglement. The permanent connection to a man she fundamentally could not trust, in a document that would govern every drought season and every low-water year for as long as she held the ranch. He'll abide by it, she said, or he won't. He'll abide by the letter of it, Ronan said, the way he's abided by the letter of every arrangement he's made in this valley, which means he'll find the margin inside it and work it until you're back in the same position. She nodded. She had known that. She had known it standing on the porch while Bram was talking. She had just needed someone to say it clearly. All right, she said, go to Friday. She sent Cal with a message to Bram's property at 1 o'clock. She wrote it short. Mr. Voss, I am declining your offer. We will see you tomorrow. E. Harrow. She didn't labor over the wording. She had labored over enough things. At 2 o'clock, she was in the barn with the mare when she heard a single horse on the road, not coming to the house, just passing on the main road, visible through the barn's open door. One of Bram's men, she thought, or gantry, moving through without stopping. That evening, Cutter came to supper and sat in his usual chair and ate, and didn't say much, which was his way when something was weighing on him. After the meal, when Pete and Cal had gone, and it was just the three of them, Cutter set his cup down and looked at the table. You declined him, he said. Not a question. I declined him, Eliza said. Cutter nodded slowly. Thomas would have, he said. For what it's worth. Thomas would have said the same. She looked at him. Cutter had known Thomas since Thomas was a young man, had worked Redstone Hollow before Thomas inherited it, had stayed when Thomas died because leaving hadn't occurred to him as a real option. There were things Cutter knew about this land and the people who had worked it that she would never fully have access to, and she respected that. Thank you, she said. He picked up his cup again. Boy, he said, which was addressed to Ronan in Cutter's particular usage of the word, meaning any man younger than 60, regardless of actual age. You still going to that hearing tomorrow? Going, Ronan said. Good. Cutter drank his coffee. Because if she has to stand up there alone one more time, I'm going to feel bad about my hip. Ronan looked at the table and said nothing, but his jaw moved in a way that meant he was suppressing a smile, which Eliza had learned to recognize over the past weeks as the nearest thing he had to an unguarded expression. She went to bed early and slept badly and was up before 4 again, which was apparently her body's position on high-stakes days, regardless of what her mind preferred. She was at the table with coffee when she heard the creak of the bunkhouse door and then boots on the porch, and Ronan came in and sat across from her and accepted the cup she'd already poured. They sat in silence for a while, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't need filling. After a time, he said, How are you? She considered giving the easy answer. She didn't. I'm frightened, she said. Not of losing the water. I mean, I'm frightened of that too, but more frightened of spending everything I have on this and finding out it wasn't enough. He held his cup with both hands. That's an honest answer. I'm tired of dishonest ones. He nodded. The fear's legitimate, he said, but it's not information. It doesn't tell you the outcome. I know that. You've done the right things, he said. You went to the right people. You found the right documents. You made the right argument. He looked at her. Whatever Purvis decides is Purvis's decision. You did the work. She looked at him across the table. The lamp was between them, and it cast the kind of light that makes faces look like they're being taken seriously, which seemed appropriate. I want to say the thing I almost said on Tuesday, she said. He was very still. Outside the land office, she said, before Cutter came with the horses. He set his cup down. I remember. I've been thinking about it since, she said. For longer than Tuesday, actually. For longer than I should probably admit. She kept her eyes on his. I don't know how to say it without sounding like I'm asking you for something you haven't offered. Then ask, he said quietly, and I'll tell you honestly whether I'm offering it. She held his gaze. I don't want this to end when the hearing ends, she said. The working together, the being here together. I don't want you to leave because the water question is resolved and your work is technically done. She paused. I want you to stay. Not as a hired hand, as something else. Something I don't have a clean word for yet. The quiet that came after that was the longest quiet she had ever sat through, and she had sat through many. The lamp burned steadily between them. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten at the eastern edge, the very first hint of a coming morning. Ronan looked at the table for a moment, then at the lamp, then at her. I told you about Wyoming, he said. You did. I told you what it did, what I decided after. You decided not to own anything you could lose, she said. He nodded slowly. What does that mean about this, she said, and she meant it not as a challenge. She meant it as a real question, because she wasn't going to pretend that a man's history was irrelevant or that 8 years of moving had left no impression on the way he thought about staying. He was quiet for a while. She didn't feel it. It means, he said finally, that what you're asking is the thing I have been most careful about since 1880. He paused. It means it would cost me something to say yes. I know, she said, and you're asking anyway. I am. He looked at her across the table with an expression that was less guarded than any expression she had seen from him before, as though the usual stillness had shifted or thinned or was at least temporarily not doing all the work it usually did. I'm not going to answer you tonight, he said. She absorbed that. All right. Not because the answer is no, he said, but because I don't want to say something this important at 4 a.m. before a hearing that matters and have you spend the whole day not knowing if I meant it or just said it in a difficult moment. He held her gaze. You deserve a real answer, not a distracted one. She felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for quite some time. Not resolution, not yet, but something adjacent to it. The feeling of being taken seriously. After the hearing, she said. After the hearing, he said. They sat in the growing morning light, and after a while, she made more coffee, and he talked about the fence repairs and what they needed before winter, practical things, ranch things, the language of the work they had been doing together for months. And she talked about the hay supply and the mortgage schedule and the cattle she was planning to sell in autumn. And underneath all of that ran the other conversation, the one they hadn't finished, present the way water is present underground even in a dry season. There, real, moving, waiting for the right moment to come to the surface. By the time Pete and Cal came in for breakfast, the sun was up, and the day was committed to itself, and Eliza had her hat on, and the leather case with the documents under her arm. Friday's hearing was different from Tuesday's. The room felt different from the moment they walked in, tighter, more charged, the way rooms feel when they're close to the conclusion of something that matters. The same chairs, the same crooked territorial seal, the same 2 windows casting the same pale morning light. But the people were different. Fewer Valley residents this time. Some had farms to work and couldn't justify a second trip to Millhaven. But the ones who were there were the key witnesses, the ones Purvis might want to re-question. And Harlan Grice was in his chair in the 3rd row, looking like he had been there since dawn, and was prepared to remain until nightfall. Whitmore came in at 9:05 with a leather document roll under his arm and the expression of a man carrying something valuable in the old-fashioned sense. Not money, but something that once mattered and still does. Purvis entered at exactly 9 o'clock. He set his satchel on the table and removed his papers and adjusted his glasses on their cord and looked at both sides of the room. His expression was professionally neutral in the way it had been Tuesday, giving nothing away, and Eliza had spent enough time in the last 3 days studying his face in memory to know that this was his working face, not his concluding face. She was going to have to wait for the concluding face. We're continuing the hearing from Tuesday, Purvis said. I have reviewed the submitted documents and the testimony of record. Today, we will hear from Mr. Whitmore regarding his 1866 deed survey and any additional final statements from either party. He looked at Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore, If you'll come forward. Whitmore came forward. He unrolled the document on Purvis's table with the careful handling of something old and significant, and Purvis leaned over it with his glasses properly on his face, and the room was very quiet. The deed survey was hand-drawn in the manner of territorial surveys of that period, precise, annotated, bearing the surveyor's seal and date in the lower right corner. Whitmore explained the notations in the methodical way of a man who understands surveying and assumes, correctly, that not everyone else does. He indicated the fixed reference points the surveyor had used to establish the Whitmore property's eastern boundary, and among those reference points, clearly notated in the surveyor's own hand, was the language established water draw, Harrow Hollow Ranch, creek running ESE, in continuous use, Refrain Territorial Filing 1863. Eliza felt Ronan shift slightly beside her. She understood why. That language, in continuous use, was the surveyor's professional notation, not testimony, not recollection. A surveyor's documented observation that the water draw was established and ongoing at the time of the 1866 survey. Gantry was very still across the room. Purvis looked at the document for a long time. He asked Whitmore 2 questions about the surveyor's credentials and the chain of custody of the document, both of which Whitmore answered with the assurance of a man who has kept his papers in better order than most. Then Purvis sat back and made a notation in his own papers. When Whitmore returned to his chair, Purvis addressed both parties. "I'll hear closing statements," he said. "Mr. Gantry." Gantry stood. He was smooth again, as he had been Tuesday, but there was something in the smoothness now that was working harder than it had been. He argued the Helena precedents again, pushed the documentary standard argument, questioned whether a notation on a deed survey constituted the kind of formal registration required by territorial water code. He was competent, and Eliza listened to every word and found, to her own slight surprise, that she was not afraid of him. "Mrs. Harrow," Purvis said. She stood. She had not practiced this specific statement, which she had decided deliberately. She had practiced the evidence and the timeline and the witnesses, but not the conclusion, because she had found in her experience that prepared conclusions often sounded like prepared conclusions, and this moment called for something more direct than that. "Mr. Purvis," she said, "my late husband's family settled this land and drew water from this creek in 1863. That use was documented by a territorial filing that year and registered in the territorial water system in 1871. It was noted as established and in continuous use by a professional surveyor in 1866. It has been attested to under oath by 14 residents of this valley, the majority of whom were present in person on Tuesday." She paused. "Bram Voss purchased his upstream parcel in 1878. He built a diversion structure this summer, 23 years after our first documented use. He filed his management claim this year." She looked at Purvis directly. "The sequence is clear, the documentation is clear, the testimony is clear. I'm asking you to recognize what the record shows, that Redstone Hollow established this water use before Mr. Voss had any claim to the upstream land, and that claim therefore cannot supersede an established prior right." She sat down. Purvis looked at his papers for a moment, then he looked up. "I'll take a brief recess before issuing my finding," he said. He went through the side door. The room held its breath. Eliza sat with her hands in her lap. Beside her, Ronan was quiet. Behind them, she could hear the small sounds of people shifting in chairs. A throat cleared, someone's boot scraping the floor. She did not turn around. She looked at the table where Purvis had been sitting, at the documents spread across it. Her documents and Bram's documents lying there together, the evidence of 2 people's claim to the same resource, waiting for someone to decide which one weighed more. She heard Bram's voice from across the room, low, just a few words to Gantry, inaudible from her position, and Gantry's response, equally inaudible. She did not look at them. Ronan said very quietly, "The surveyor's notation." "I know," she said. "In continuous use," he said. "That's the language. That's what closes the case." "Maybe," she said. "Eliza," he said, and the way he said her name, quietly, simply, like it was something he had permission to say and knew it, made her look at him. "You did it right," he said. "Whatever he decides, you did this right." She held his gaze for a moment. There was something in his expression that was the closest she had seen him come to unguarded in a public place, and she thought about what he'd said that morning. that he would give her a real answer after the hearing, that she deserved a real answer. And she thought about 14 signatures in a leather case and a dog named Rue sitting on a porch in Wyoming, and a diversion gate built in the night, and a woman who refused to sign a paper on her own kitchen table. She thought about all of it. Then the side door opened and Purvis came back. He sat at the table and arranged his papers with the deliberate neatness of a man who has made a decision and is organized enough in his mind that his hands know exactly what to do while he formulates the words. He looked up. In the matter of Voss versus Harrow, regarding water rights to the tributary creek running through sections 14 and 15, he said, I find as follows. He paused. The documentary record, including the 1863 territorial filing, the 1871 Water Register notation bearing counter-signature of the Assistant Territorial Water Register, and the 1860 Professional Deed Survey notation establishing the water draw as in continuous use, constitutes sufficient evidence of prior established use by Redstone Hollow Ranch under the Harrow family from a date preceding Mr. Voss's acquisition of the upstream parcel by a minimum of 15 years. He looked down at his papers, then back up. Prior established use supersedes later management claims under Territorial Water Code. Mr. Voss's filing of August 1886 does not constitute a valid override of established prior rights. Accordingly, I am rejecting the Voss management claim and recognizing Redstone Hollow Ranch's established water rights to the tributary creek in question. The diversion structure erected this summer must be removed within 30 days. This finding is entered into the territorial record. He stamped the document. The sound of the stamp on the paper was a small sound, just a sound. But in the room, it landed the way the first real rain lands after a long dry season. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, just with the overwhelming relief of something that was needed finally arriving. Behind Eliza, Walt Penbrook exhaled audibly. May Aldine made a sound that was not quite a word. Harlan Grice said nothing, which from Harlan Grice was its own form of significant response. Eliza sat very still. She had spent months afraid of this moment going wrong. She had not fully planned for what it felt like to go right. Ronan put his hand over hers on the chair arm. Just briefly, just once. Then he took it back, because they were in a public proceeding and he was that kind of man. But she felt it. Bram Voss stood on the other side of the room and looked at Gantry, and Gantry was already gathering papers with the focused attention of a lawyer, pivoting to the next problem. Bram's face was still, controlled, showing nothing that could be used against him. He was not a man who lost visibly. But Purvis's stamp was on the paper. He looked across the room at Eliza. Directly, for a sustained moment. She met it. He gave her very slightly a nod. Not concession, more acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of a man who has been in a contest and knows when the other person has won it fairly. Then he put on his hat and walked out. Gantry followed without looking at Eliza. The room began to move and talk, and the specific tension that had held everyone in careful stillness released itself into conversation and movement, and from Harlan Grice, a prolonged and satisfied clearing of the throat that served as his version of celebration. May Aldine appeared beside Eliza. "Well," she said. "Well," Eliza said. "Your water's yours," May said. It was the simplest possible statement of what had happened and exactly the right one. Walt Penbrook shook her hand with the firm grip of a man raised to express things through handshakes rather than words. Dutch Harker said something brief and genuine. Clara Foss found her near the door and looked at her with an expression that had something unfinished in it, something that wasn't quite resolved even by a legal victory, and Eliza understood, because Clara's 12 acres were still gone, and her husband was still gone, and a land hearing in Mill Haven didn't restore those things. "What Purvis found today," Eliza said to her quietly, "is in the record now. If you ever need it for anything, anything about Bram's conduct, it's there." Clara looked at her. "You'd help with that?" "If it ever came to it, yes." Clara nodded. It wasn't enough. It was something. Outside, the street was bright in the mid-morning sun and the air was clean after the rain, and Eliza stood on the boardwalk of the Territorial Land Office and let the moment exist without immediately doing anything about it. Ronan stood beside her. "Helena," she said. "He can still go," Ronan said. "But I don't think he will." "Why not?" Because the record now shows he built a diversion structure on contested water and filed a claim designed to strip an established prior right from a widow 2 years after buying adjacent land. He paused. Taking that to Helena means a larger audience for that story. A man with Bram's reputation in this territory isn't going to want that story told in front of Helena judges. She thought about that. So it's over. The water part, he said. She looked at him. He was watching the street, not her, with the particular gaze of a man who has said something specific and is waiting to see how it lands. The water part, she repeated. He turned to look at her. You said after the hearing, he said. It's after the hearing. The street was doing what streets do. A horse went past. Someone came out of the feed store across the way. A dog crossed in the direction of something interesting. All of it happening around them with the indifference of normal daily life proceeding normally. I did say that, she said. He looked at her steadily. Not with the careful stillness she had seen for months, the managed distance of a man who had decided what he could afford to feel. Something different. Something that was present rather than contained. My answer is yes, he said. To what you asked this morning. She looked at him in the morning light on the main street of Millhaven with the leather case under her arm and the fresh stamp of a territorial land agent's ruling in it, and felt something move through her that was entirely distinct from any of the feelings the last 9 months had delivered. Yes, she said. Yes, he said. It was not a romantic scene. Cutter was 20 feet away inspecting his horses with deliberate attention, which was its own form of courtesy. May Aldine was still on the boardwalk 3 steps down. The street was public and ordinary. They were 2 people standing in the morning sun confirming something they had been moving toward for months. But it was real. It was the realest thing that had happened all day, which was a day that had already contained a territorial water ruling. We should ride home, she said. We should, he said. They rode home. The valley looked different on the way back, or she looked at it differently, which amounted to the same thing. The grass that had been too dry, the creek that had been too low, the mountains that had been obscuring themselves in cloud for weeks. All of it was the same as it had been that morning, and she was different in it, which changed everything. Cutter rode beside her for a while without speaking, then said, Thomas would be satisfied. She thought about that. He'd want to know exactly what documentation won the case, she said. He'd want all the details. And then he'd be satisfied, Cutter said. She smiled. Yes. And then. They came through the ranch gate in the early afternoon, and the cattle were in the south pasture, and Pete was mending something near the barn, and everything was as they had left it that morning, the ordinary substance of a working ranch, proceeding through an ordinary Friday, indifferent to what had happened 20 miles away in a small building with a crooked seal on the wall. She dismounted and led her horse to the barn, and took her time unsaddling and didn't rush toward the next thing. The next thing would come. The diversion gate still needed to be removed. The water level would take time to restore. There was hay to source before winter, and the mortgage due, on the first and a dozen other obligations stacked up behind this day, waiting for her attention. But for this moment she stood in the barn doorway, with the afternoon light coming in at a low angle, and the leather case leaning against the wall beside her, and the mare in her stall behind her, and she let the day be what it was. Ronan came in from putting up his horse and stopped beside her in the doorway. The gate comes down this weekend, he said. Yes, she said. I can ride out with Pete tomorrow and start. I'll come with you, she said. He nodded. They stood in the doorway a moment longer. Ronan, she said. He looked at her. I'm glad you didn't leave when Roundup ended, she said. I know that's when you were thinking about it. I was thinking about it, he admitted. What stopped you? He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when the honest answer was the one that cost something. You said something, he said, about avoiding loss not being the same as living. She remembered. Standing in the dark of a valley day, tired and frustrated and pushing back at the thing he'd been carrying since Wyoming. I didn't think you were listening, she said. I was listening, he said. I'm almost always listening. She looked at him in the afternoon light of the barn doorway on the day the water was saved and something else was beginning, and she thought that she had come within 1,000 small decisions of not being here, of having sold the ranch in February when the mortgage felt crushing and the cold was unrelenting and Cutter's hip was bad, and she had no one to help her. Within 1,000 small refusals of the easier path. She was glad of every one of them. The diversion gate came down on a Saturday. Ronan and Pete rode out at first light with a wagon, tools, and the kind of quiet purposefulness that working men bring to a task when the task carries weight beyond its physical dimensions. Eliza rode with them, which she had said she would do and which Ronan had not argued against, because he had learned by now that arguing with Eliza about whether she would be present for something important was a conversation that ended predictably. The gate was heavier than it looked. The timber was thick, the iron hardware substantial, the whole structure built with the intention of permanence. Bram had not constructed a temporary diversion. He had built something meant to last, which made the taking of it apart a different kind of satisfaction than a simple demolition, the kind that comes from undoing something that was made to be undone by no one. It took 4 hours. Pete worked without complaint, which was Pete's consistent quality. Ronan worked with the systematic efficiency he brought to everything physical, and Eliza helped where she could and stayed out of the way where she couldn't and watched the water change as the gate came apart piece by piece. It didn't surge. She had expected it to surge, had imagined the creek running hard and fast the moment the diversion was cleared. Instead, it found its way back gradually, feeling out the old channel the way water always does, remembering a path it had been pushed away from, moving tentatively at first and then with more confidence as the obstruction cleared and the channel deepened, and the natural grade did what natural grades do. By mid-morning, there was a real flow again. Not what it had been in spring. The summer had been dry and the season's deficit didn't reverse in an afternoon. But real. Moving. Going where it had always gone. Eliza stood at the creek bank and watched it run. She was not a person who cried easily. She had not cried when the bank came in February with the mortgage notice, or when the second hired hand left without telling her, or when she stood in the hearing room and heard Gantry's argument and felt the case shift beneath her feet. She had not cried when Purvis stamped the paper, though she had come close. She cried now briefly, standing at the creek bank with nobody watching because Ronan and Pete were loading the gate timber into the wagon and their backs were turned. She let herself have it for about 30 seconds. The specific release of 9 months of sustained, coiled effort, finding a moment to unwind. And then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and went to help load timber. Ronan glanced at her when she came alongside the wagon. He didn't say anything. She didn't explain. He handed her the smaller end of a timber section and they loaded it together. On the ride back, with the wagon loaded and the creek running behind them, Pete said, "That felt good." "Yes," Eliza said. "Taking something apart that shouldn't have been built," Pete said, "feels different than other work." Ronan drove the wagon without contributing to this, but the set of his shoulders was different from the morning set, and she noticed. She noticed most things about him now, which was a change that had happened so gradually she couldn't identify its beginning. The weekend after the gate came down, Bram Voss did not appear. No men on the fence line, no messages through intermediaries, no further cuts to the wire. The following week was the same. Eliza held herself in a kind of alert readiness for the next move, because she had learned that the absence of a visible move from Bram didn't mean the absence of a move, only the absence of visibility. But the days passed and the creek ran and the cattle began putting weight back on in the south pasture where the grass was recovering. And October came into the valley with its particular cold clarity, the air sharp and the light lower, and the mountains finally committing to the snow that had been building on their peaks since August. Gantry sent a letter. It arrived on a Tuesday. Eliza noted the day because she had developed a complicated relationship with Tuesdays and was written in the precise, formal language that Gantry used for official correspondence. It informed her that his client had reviewed the territorial finding and, following consultation with Helena Council, had determined that the grounds for appeal did not meet the threshold required for a favorable outcome at the higher level, and therefore no appeal would be filed. The finding of record would stand. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table. Ronan was across from her eating breakfast. He looked at her expression and then at the letter. "Helena?" he said. "He's not going," she said. Ronan picked up his coffee. He didn't say "I told you so," which was one of the things she had come to appreciate specifically about him. The absence of that particular habit that men with good judgment sometimes develop. "It's over," she said. "The water part," he said, which was what he'd said outside the land office the day of the ruling. And it had the same quality now that it had then. The acknowledgement of one conclusion alongside the awareness of another that was still in motion. She looked at him across the table. The water part, she agreed. They had been careful with each other since Friday. Not distant, the opposite of distant, actually, more consistently present in each other's spaces than they had been before, more direct in small ways that weren't dramatic but accumulated. He had fixed the kitchen window latch that had been sticking since August without being asked. She had started leaving his coffee ready when she knew he was coming in early. These were not grand gestures. They were the small language of people who have decided something and are living in the decided thing before it is fully formalized. But there were things that weren't yet said, and they both knew it, and there was a quality to the knowing that was not quite tension and not quite patience, something between the two, a careful waiting that was aware of itself. Cutter was not subtle about any of it. He said, at supper one evening the following week, with Pete and Cal both present, and therefore with an audience he either didn't notice or didn't care about, "You two are going to have to figure out the arrangement before winter, because I am too old and my hip hurts too much to be living in uncertainty about the future of this outfit." Pete looked at his plate. Cal looked at the ceiling. Eliza said, "Cutter." "I'm just saying," Cutter said. "You're saying it in front of two hired men." "Pete and Cal have eyes," Cutter said. "They've known what's happening since August. I think we can speak plainly." Pete said, to his plate, "I don't mind." Cal said, still to the ceiling, "Me neither." Eliza put her fork down. She looked at Ronan. Ronan was looking at his cup with the expression of a man who is genuinely amused and is making a moderate effort to not show it, which she could read clearly by now and found unexpectedly endearing. "All right," she said. "Fine." She looked at Cutter. "We're figuring it out." "Good," Cutter said, and resumed eating. Because winter comes the same time every year regardless of personal circumstances. It was not the most romantic context for the conversation that followed later that evening, after supper, after Pete and Cal had gone, and Cutter had made his careful way to his room, and the house was quiet in the particular way of late October nights in Montana, with the wind beginning to find its winter voice outside, and the stove warming the kitchen against the cold that pressed against the windows. They sat at the kitchen table, which was where most of the real conversations happened. Ronan said, "Cutter's not wrong." "He's rarely wrong," she said. "He's just usually less public about it." "I've been thinking about what you asked," he said, "what I said yes to, outside the land office." She waited. "I want to be clear about what I'm saying yes to," he said. "Not just staying, not just a continued arrangement that doesn't have a name." He looked at her directly. "I'm saying yes to building something here, if that's what you're asking." "That's what I'm asking," she said. "I need you to understand what that costs me," he said. "Not as a complaint, just honestly. Because the last time I built something, losing it took 8 years to stop being the thing I woke up thinking about." He held her gaze. "And this is bigger than what I had in Wyoming. This is your land and your history and your name on the deed and the weight of everything Thomas was. And if I—" He stopped, started again. "If I put myself into this and something takes it away, I don't know what that does to me. I don't know if I come back from that a second time." She sat with that for a moment, the honesty of it, the cost of saying it. "I can't promise you nothing bad will happen," she said. "I can't promise the weather cooperates or the beef price holds or some other version of Bramvoss doesn't come along with a different problem." She held his gaze across the table. "I can tell you that whatever comes, we carry it the same way we carried the last 9 months. Together. And that being afraid of losing this doesn't mean you shouldn't have it." He was quiet. "You told me," she said, "that avoiding loss isn't the same as living." "You told me that," he said. "I just believed it." She looked at him. "Ronan." "Eliza." "I'm not Thomas," she said. "I'm not asking you to be Thomas. I'm not asking you to step into someone else's life and wear it. I'm asking you to build something that's ours, different from what was here before." She paused. "Different doesn't mean lesser." He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. "I know that," he said quietly. "I think I've known that for a while." "Then what are we waiting for?" she said. The question sat between them. He said, "Nothing, I think." She reached across the table and he took her hand and held it, and they sat like that in the kitchen that was warm from the stove and cold outside the windows. And the wind moved against the house, and the cattle were settled in the pasture, and the creek was running at a reasonable level for October, and the mortgage was due on the 1st, which was 11 days away, and she had a plan for it, and everything was imperfect and ongoing and real. They were married in November, 3 weeks before the first heavy snow. It was not a large ceremony. The Reverend from Mill Haven came out on a clear, cold morning, and Cutter stood beside Ronan, and May Aldine stood beside Eliza. May had offered this without being asked, in a tone that made it clear refusal was not a sensible option, and Eliza had accepted gratefully. Walt and June Penbrook came. Harlan Grice came, driven by his neighbor's son, and sat in the front chair wrapped in a heavy coat and looked satisfied in the way of a man who has seen a thing through from beginning to a good end. Pete and Cal cleaned up for the occasion, which involved combing their hair and wearing their better shirts, and stood at the back with the particular self-consciousness of young men at events they aren't sure how to inhabit. It was cold and clear and brief, because standing outside in Montana in November favors brevity, and they went inside afterward, and May had brought food, and June Penbrook had brought a cake that was better than anything the occasion technically required, and Harlan Grice drank coffee and told a story about a winter he'd survived in 1861 that made everyone feel the present winter was probably manageable. At one point, Eliza found herself standing at the kitchen window with a cup of something warm, looking out at the pasture where the cattle were clustered near the south fence, and Ronan came and stood beside her, and they both looked out at the ranch in the November light. "That's yours," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Ours," he said. The words sat between them. Simple, specific, the way important words often are. "Ours," she agreed. He put his arm around her, which was the first time he had done that, and she leaned into it, and they stood there watching their cattle in their pasture on their ranch. And the creek was a thin silver line at the edge of the view, running steady and real. Winter came down hard 3 weeks later, the way Montana winters do when they've been patient long enough. Not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, the temperature dropping 20 degrees in a night and the snow arriving behind it like it had somewhere important to be. The first morning after the first serious storm, Eliza stood on the porch at 6 in the morning in the dark and felt the cold touch her face and looked at the white that had remade every familiar shape into something both the same and different. She heard boots on the porch boards behind her. Ronan came and stood beside her in the dark with his coat on and his hat and a cup of coffee that steamed considerably in the cold air. "Fence check," she said. "In an hour," he said, "when there's light." She nodded. They stood there in the cold for a moment, looking at the white. "It's going to be a hard winter," she said. "Yes," he said. "We've got enough hay. Cal's the better rider in snow. I'll put him on the east fence. Pete can manage the south trough." He paused. "The water situation's better than last year. Creek's been running at the right level since October." She turned to look at him. He was talking about the winter management of Redstone Hollow. The way a man talks about a thing that is his responsibility. Not a hired man accounting for tasks, but a person accounting for what he is responsible for because it matters to him. Because it is his. She had not known how much she needed to hear that until she heard it. "Ronan," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for staying." He looked at her with an expression she knew well by now. The one that was direct and unguarded and slightly uncomfortable with anything that might require him to say more than was necessary. "You asked me to," he said. "Plenty of people get asked to stay and don't," she said. He considered this. "True." "I mean it," she said. "Everything that happened last summer, the hearing, the witnesses, the documents, the fence cutting, and the Watergate and all of it, I couldn't have held it together without you." "You would have," he said. "I might have," she said. "But I didn't have to. You were here." She paused. "I don't take that lightly." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Neither do I." They went in when the light came up and the day started, which is what days do regardless of how significant the night before them was. And Ronan rode the fence with Cal, and Pete handled the trough, and Cutter supervised from the barn doorway, wrapped in 2 coats, and offering opinions that nobody asked for and everyone appreciated. And Eliza did the books at the kitchen table, and the numbers were not comfortable, but they were manageable, which was an improvement over the previous year's numbers. And the mortgage due on the 1st got paid on the 1st, and there was enough left for February and March if beef prices held. They were not prosperous. They were not going to be prosperous for some time. But the difference between surviving and failing is not always measured in comfort, and Eliza had developed over the past year a specific respect for the distinction between a hard situation that is stable and a hard situation that is deteriorating. Redstone Hollow was stable. The water was secured. The cattle were healthy. The operation was sound. That was enough to build on. In December, something happened that Eliza had not expected. A letter arrived from Bram Voss. Not from Gantry, from Bram himself, in handwriting she hadn't seen before, which was surprisingly neat for a man she had categorized entirely by his actions rather than his penmanship. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first acknowledged the territorial ruling in terms that were formal and stripped of any remaining contest. The second noted that his operation would be proceeding with adjustments that accounted for the established water rights of neighboring properties. She understood this to mean he was accepting, finally, the reality of what the valley's water situation actually was, rather than what he had been engineering it to be. The third paragraph was the one she read 3 times. It said, "I am not in the habit of writing these kinds of letters, and I don't expect you to believe that I've had some conversion of character that turns a rival into a neighbor. I am not that kind of man, and I know it. But I want to say plainly that you fought a fair fight, and I lost it fairly, and that the case you made, both the legal case and the one you made about what I had been doing in this valley, was correct. I won't say I wouldn't do it again if circumstances were different, because I don't know if that's true. What I will say is that this valley is better run when the people in it know their rights are actual rights, and not just paper that can be worked around by someone with more resources. You demonstrated that. I acknowledge it." She sat with the letter for a long time. She showed it to Ronan. He read it and handed it back. He said, which was a sound she had come to associate with genuine consideration of something unexpected. "What do you make of it?" she said. "I make it that Bram Voss is a man who respects a thing done well, even when it's done against him." He paused. "Doesn't make him trustworthy. Makes him complicated." "Can I trust it?" she said. "Trust what he wrote," Ronan said. "Not more than what he wrote." That seemed right to her. She put the letter in the document box where she kept the 1863 filing, and the register notation, and the testimony papers, all of it together, the record of that summer, the material evidence of a fight she had not asked for and had won anyway. The letter fit there, she thought. It was part of the record. The winter passed the way Montana winters pass, slowly, coldly, with occasional moments of real beauty that you notice while you're doing something else. The cattle came through it reasonably. The creek stayed open longer than she'd expected because the flow was healthy and the grade worked in her favor. Cutter's hip gave him 3 bad weeks in January, during which he was confined to the house and was consequently the most thoroughly opinionated person in the valley for that period until the cold broke in early February and he was able to get back to the barn, at which point his opinions distributed themselves more evenly across a wider range of subjects rather than concentrating at whoever happened to be in the kitchen. Ronan found his way into Redstone Hollow's rhythms the way water finds its way into soil. Not dramatically, not all at once, but thoroughly, until you stopped noticing the process and simply found it was complete. He and Pete and Cal developed the efficient shorthand of men who work together long enough that fewer words are needed. He had a way with the cattle that was different from Thomas's way. Thomas had been patient and methodical. Ronan was patient and instinctive. And the difference expressed itself in small ways that only someone watching closely would notice. The cattle knew him now. The mare knew him. The ranch knew him, in whatever way a piece of land can know a person, which is through the marks left on it, and the changes worked into it, and the presence accumulated there. He was not Thomas. He had never tried to be Thomas. He was himself, which was a specific and significant person, and he was here, which was the fact that mattered most in the daily operation of a working ranch. He and Eliza argued sometimes. She wanted to note this because she had observed that people who tell the stories of their lives have a tendency to sand the rough parts smooth. In retrospect, to present the good thing as having been easy and the easy thing as having been pleasant. And the truth was that 2 people who both had strong opinions and direct personalities and had each spent a significant portion of their adult lives making decisions alone did not merge their decision-making without friction. The first real argument was about the cattle sale in March. She wanted to sell 12 head to cover a supply debt and reduce the winter strain on the hay. He thought they should hold them until May, when the price would be better, and reduce the supply debt by deferring a different payment. They sat at the table for 2 hours going back and forth about it, neither one giving ground easily, both of them making arguments that had genuine merit, and the argument had the specific quality of disagreements between people who respect each other enough to not back down simply to avoid conflict. She sold 8 and deferred part of the payment. It was a compromise that neither of them had proposed, and both of them found workable, which was, she thought, approximately what a good partnership looked like in practice. The second argument was about the roof on the smaller barn, which she thought could wait and he thought could not, and which developed into a broader disagreement about risk tolerance that revealed something genuine about the difference in how they had each arrived at this point in their lives. She had been maintaining a property in crisis for a year with limited resources, and her calibration of what could wait had been necessarily compressed. He had spent 8 years watching small deferred problems become large urgent ones on other people's ranches, and his calibration went the other direction. Neither position was wrong. They were the product of different experiences being applied to the same situation. The roof got fixed in April. She did not tell him he was right. He did not make her. Spring arrived with the determination of something that has been suppressed for 5 months and has opinions about it. The grass came back greener than the previous year. The creek's restored flow had done something good for the soil through the winter, and she could see the difference in the pasture color by late April, a richness that hadn't been there the summer before. The cattle spread across it, and the calves that had come through the winter were strong. Cutter, watching the pasture from the fence one afternoon in May, said, "The land knows." "Knows what?" Eliza said. "When it's being kept right," he said. "It shows. Not right away. Over time." He looked at the grass. "Your father-in-law kept this land right. Thomas kept it right." He paused. "You kept it right through the worst year it's had." She leaned on the fence beside him and looked at the pasture. "We," she said. "We," he agreed. The formal legal work on the water rights happened in June. Ronan had suggested, and the Valley's lawyer had confirmed, that following the territorial ruling, it was possible to have the established water rights entered into the property deed as a specific attached right. Not just a ruling of record, but a deed-incorporated right that would travel with the land in perpetuity, undisputable by any future claimant without overturning the underlying deed itself. It cost money she didn't easily have, and it took 3 trips to Millhaven and 2 documents sent to Helena and 6 weeks of waiting, but in the 3rd week of June, a registered document came back from the territorial office attaching the established water rights of the tributary creek to the Redstone Hollow deed in perpetuity. She sat at the kitchen table and read it, and then set it in the document box with the others. The vulnerability that Bram had found and exploited was closed. Not just defended, closed. Whatever came next, whatever dry summer or land dispute or change of circumstance arrived in the future of this ranch, the water was in the deed. Thomas had worked the land for 6 years without ever having that security. His father had worked it for 15 years before him. The creek had been there all along, foundational to everything they had built, and neither of them had ever thought to formalize it because it had never been threatened. Eliza had learned the lesson. She had put it in writing. That was the thing experience was for. Ronan's contribution to this particular piece of work had been the knowledge that it was possible. He had known about deed-attached water rights from the survey work in his early 20s and had mentioned it quietly to her attorney during one of the Millhaven trips, and the attorney had confirmed it was available under territorial code and had pursued it. Ronan didn't take credit for it. He rarely took credit for the things he did that worked, which was a quality she found slightly maddening and deeply characteristic. She told him, when the document arrived, "This was your idea." "I mentioned it was possible," he said. "You made it happen." "We made it happen," she said. He looked at her. "We," she said again. "That's the arrangement." He held her gaze with an expression that was the warm version of his usually still face, the version she saw in private moments, the one he didn't put on for the world, but also didn't hide from her anymore. "All right," he said. "We." Cutter retired in August. It was not entirely a surprise. She had been watching his hip worsen through the spring and had been thinking about how to raise the subject without wounding the dignity of a man who had spent his whole adult life being useful. He raised it himself, which was like Cutter, on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen with his coffee, telling her plainly that he thought he'd worked the last season he had in him and that his nephew in Billings had been asking him to come and he was thinking he might. When, she said. October, he said, before the heavy cold. She looked at him across the table. He was 64 years old and had been on this property since before Thomas inherited it, and had stayed when Thomas died and had done more to keep Redstone Hollow functional through the worst year of its operation than she would ever be able to fully account for. Cutter, she said, I need you to know. I know, he said. He said it without impatience, just directly, the way Cutter said most things. And I appreciate it. Thomas would say the same. He drank his coffee. The ranch is in better shape than it's been in 2 years. It's in good hands. He looked at Ronan, who was at the stove, and had the courtesy to pretend he wasn't listening. Both of you. He stayed through September, training the 2 new hands she hired, a young man named Webb, who was strong and willing to learn, and an older hand named Grady, who had 15 years of Montana ranching behind him, and came with references she actually had time to check. Both men took Ronan's direction without the particular resistance she had encountered with some earlier hires, partly because Ronan did not give direction in a way that invited resistance, and partly because the ranch had a different quality now than it had had when hired hands were quitting rather than take orders from a widow. It had the quality of a working ranch going somewhere. People noticed that, even without being told. Cutter left on a clear October morning. He said goodbye to the cattle, which was the kind of thing that would have been strange from anyone else and was entirely in character from him. He said goodbye to Pete and Cal and Webb and Grady in the yard. He shook Ronan's hand and said, Take care of this place. Yes, sir, Ronan said. He looked at Eliza for a moment. He had a limited vocabulary for this kind of moment, which she knew, and she helped him by not requiring more than he had. You did good, he said. She kissed his cheek, which he accepted with the flustered dignity of a man unaccustomed to affection. He climbed onto the wagon his nephew had sent and went down the road and turned north at the gate, and she watched him go until she couldn't see the wagon anymore. And then she turned back to the ranch that was still standing in the October light, needing its usual things, indifferent to her feelings about them in the way that work is always indifferent to feelings and must be done regardless. The first roundup with Ronan as she had been searching for the right word and had settled, eventually, on the word partner, which was accurate without being complicated. The first roundup with Ronan as her partner was different from every previous roundup. Not because it went better, though it did, partly. Different because she wasn't watching the whole operation alone, tracking every person and every problem from a single vantage point, running the calculations in her head about what would happen if this piece failed or that piece didn't come together. She still tracked it. She still knew the numbers and the positions and the condition of every animal. But there was another mind doing the same thing alongside hers, and the 2 minds did not duplicate each other. They covered different ground, noticed different things, and when they compared at the end of the day what they'd each seen, the picture was more complete than either alone could have assembled. This was the thing she had not known to articulate about what she needed. Not help in the charitable sense. Not someone to carry tasks she couldn't carry alone. A person who was genuinely invested in the outcome. Someone for whom this land and these animals mattered not because they were paid to matter, but because they were theirs. The roundup took 5 days. They lost no cattle. They brought in the strongest fall herd she had run since Thomas died. That evening, sitting at the kitchen table, she had not counted how many significant things had happened at that table in the past year and a half, but she thought the number was high enough to give the table some kind of sentimental recognition. Ronan looked at the numbers she had tallied and said, This is a good result. It is, she said. He looked at her. You're not going to say anything else about it. What else is there to say? Most people would say something celebratory. I'm saying this is a good result, she said. That's celebratory coming from me. He looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said. I suppose it is. They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, which was a different kind of silence from the silences of a year ago. Those had been careful, calibrated, aware of what was not being said. This one was simply easy. The silence of 2 people who have said the important things and don't need to keep saying them. Then he said, I found something this morning. She looked up. He reached into his coat pocket and set something on the table between them. It was a small, worn object. She leaned forward and saw it was a photograph, creased and faded at the edges. A dog. Border collie, she thought, looking at the markings. Standing on a porch step, looking directly at the camera with the alert expression of a dog that takes its responsibilities seriously. "Rue," she said. "Found it in the bottom of my traveling bag," he said. "Haven't opened that bag since I unpacked it last spring." She looked at the photograph. The dog's eyes were clear even through the fade and age of the image, and she understood, looking at it, exactly what Ronan had left behind when he left Wyoming. Not just land and cattle and a built life, but the specific texture of a daily existence that had been his and then hadn't been, the small beloved things that don't make it into the accounting of loss, but are the loss, at the human level where loss is actually felt. "She was a good dog," she said. "She was," he said. He looked at the photograph for a moment. "I don't need to carry it in the bag anymore," he said. "I thought I'd put it up somewhere." She looked at him. He was looking at the photograph, not her, but his voice had the quality it had when something mattered, and he was saying it as plainly as he could. "There's a shelf in the parlor," she said, "above the mantel." He nodded. He picked up the photograph and went to the parlor, and she heard him setting it on the shelf. And when he came back, his hands were empty, and his expression was the settled kind. The expression of a person who has put something where it belongs. She thought about all the things that find their way onto the shelves of a life that is being built. The documents and the photographs and the small objects that represent the weight of experience. The hard winters and the fair hearings and the creeks that run or don't run and the dogs that waited on porches and the people who stayed when they could have left. She thought about what it meant to have something worth losing. The people who spend their lives avoiding loss are not wrong that loss is painful. They are wrong about what avoidance costs. You pay for the protection every day in the currency of smaller living, and the bill comes due eventually whether you've protected yourself or not. Because the world doesn't let you opt out of caring about things. It only lets you choose which things you let yourself care about. Ronan had chosen. She had watched him do it, over months. The gradual recommitment of a man who had decided once that he would not let anything matter enough to hurt him, and had discovered, as most people eventually discover, that this decision was not actually available. You love a place or a person or a way of life, and it matters. That's not a failure of caution. That's just what alive feels like. On a September evening, a year after the water rights were written into the deed, 2 years, roughly, since Bram Voss had walked through her door with his paper and his 4 words and his assumption that she would fold, Eliza stood on the porch of Redstone Hollow Ranch at the end of a roundup day and watched the light go amber over the valley. The dust from the cattle was still settling. The mountains were clear. The creek, she could not see it from the porch, but she knew it was there, knew its sound and its level and its particular quality on an autumn evening, knew it the way she knew everything about this land was running well. Ronan came out and stood beside her. His shirt was dirty from the day's work, and he needed a shave, and he was carrying 2 cups, one of which he handed to her without being asked. They stood and looked at the valley. "Bram sold the Aldine parcel," she said. He looked at her. "May's land?" "The parcel adjacent to hers," she said. "He bought it in '83 and never developed it. Sold it to a young couple from Billings who want to run sheep." Ronan considered this. "He's pulling back." "Quietly," she said. "Not dramatically, but yes." "May said the new couple have already been to visit her," she said, "asked her advice about the terrain." "Good neighbors," Ronan said. "Good start," she said. "We'll see." He nodded. The light was shifting in the way it shifts in September evenings in Montana, the whole valley going golden in stages, the grass and the fence lines and the distant trees catching the last direct sun before it dropped behind the western ridge. She looked at her ranch, the house that Thomas had built and that she had kept, and that Ronan was now in the process of expanding. They had broken ground on the additional room in August, a project whose construction had generated 3 separate arguments and 1 afternoon of near-disastrous lumber miscalculation, and which was going to be finished by spring if the winter was reasonable. The cattle in the south pasture, the horses in the corral, Webb doing something near the barn, moving with the comfortable competence of a man who has been somewhere long enough to know its rhythms. Grady coming in from the east fence on his horse, unhurried, the way people move at the end of a good day. This was what she had refused to sell. Not just the acreage, not just the deed, not just the water rights entered into permanent record by a territorial land agent in Mill Haven. This, the accumulated, ongoing, imperfect, daily reality of a working life in a place you have chosen and that has chosen you. Thomas had known what it was. He had tried to hand it to her intact and had not had the time to finish the job. She had spent a year and a half finishing it herself, and in the finishing she had changed it and been changed by it and added something to it that hadn't been there before, not replacing what Thomas had built, but extending it into a future he hadn't lived to see. That seemed right to her. That seemed like the honest account of it. "Ronan," she said. He looked at her. "That first day," she said. "At the fence, when you rode up." He waited. "You said you heard a widow was fighting to keep her land against a man who expected her to fold," she said, "and you thought it was worth seeing." "I said that," he said. She looked at him. "Was it?" He held her gaze for a moment. The light was doing what it did, and the valley was doing what it did, and the ranch was going through the end of a roundup day the way it had been going through the ends of days for 25 years without ceasing. "Yes," he said, "worth more than seeing, as it turned out." She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood on the porch in the September light, and neither of them said anything for a while because the saying had been done, over the course of a long, hard year and a half of specific and difficult living, and what remained was simply the fact of standing here together on this ground, which was theirs, in this light, which was everyone's, at the end of a good day in a life that had refused to be anything less than real. The widow who everyone expected to surrender had kept her land. She had kept more than that. And beside her stood a man who had spent 8 years believing that the only safe thing was to own nothing, and had finally understood, not in a single dramatic moment, but slowly, the way water finds its level, the way grass comes back after a hard winter, that the things worth having are exactly the things worth the risk of losing. You don't build a life by protecting yourself from it. You build it by staying,